true. Our brains are still in a dopamine deficit state 2 weeks after we've been using our drug. And then a study by Shuckett and Brown, which took a group of depressed men who also were addicted to alcohol, put them in a hospital where they had received no treatment for depression, but they had no access to alcohol in that time. And after 4 weeks, 80% of them no longer met criteria for major depression. So again, this idea that by depriving ourselves of this high dopamine, high reward substance or behavior, we allow our brains to regenerate its own dopamine for the balance to really equilibrate, and then we're in a place where we can sort of enjoy other things.
So that progressive narrowing of what brings one pleasure eventually expands. So I'd like to dissect out that 30 days a little more finally. And I also want to address, how does one stop doing something for 30 days if the thing is a thought? So we're going to put that on the shelf for a moment. So days 1 through 10, I would imagine will be very uncomfortable.
Yes.
They're going to suck, basically, to be quite honest, because the way you describe this pleasure-pain balance, to my mind, says that if you remove what little pleasure one is getting, or a lot of pleasure from engaging in some behavior, that's gone. The pain system is really ramped up, and nothing is making me feel good. I'll just use myself as an example. I'm not in recovery, but that 10 days is going to be miserable.
Right.
Anxiety, trouble sleeping, physical agitation to the point where maybe impulsive, angry. Should one expect all of that? Should the family members of people expect all of that?
Yeah, so what I say to patients, and it's a really important piece of this intervention, is that you will feel worse before you feel better.
For how long?
Yeah.
Is it probably the first question I ask, right?
And I say usually in my clinical experience, you'll feel worse for 2 weeks. But if you can make it through those first 2 weeks, the sun will start to come out in week 3. And by week 4, most people are feeling a whole lot better than they were before they stopped using their substance. So you have to, it's a hard thing. Like, you have to sign up for it. And I will say, obviously, there are people with addictions that are so severe that as long as they have access to their drug or behavior, they're not able to stop themselves. And that's why we have, higher levels of care or residential treatment. So this is not going to be for everybody, this intervention, but it's amazing how many people with really severe addictions to things like heroin, cocaine, very severe pornography addictions. I posit this, and I do it as an experiment. I said, let's try this experiment. I'm always amazed, number one, how many of them are willing, and number two, how many of them are actually able to do it. They are able to do it. And so that little nudge is sort of just what they need. And the carrot is, there's a better life out there for you. And you'll be able to taste it in a month. You really will be able to begin to see that you can feel better and that there's another way.
So the way you describe it seems like it's hard, but it's doable for most people, not everybody.
Right.
And we'll return to that category of people who can't do that on their own. Then days 21 through 30, people are feeling better. The sun is starting to come out, as you mentioned, which translates in the narrative we've created here and supported by biology, that dopamine is starting to be released in response to the taste of a really good cup of coffee.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas before it was only to insert, addictive behavior.
Right, that's right.
Whichever.
Of course, coffee can be addictive too, but we'll leave that aside.
Yeah. I feel like coffee has a kind of consumption limiting mechanism built in, where at some point you just can't ingest anymore. But maybe that's wrong. Sorry to give lift to the caffeine addicts out there as I clutch my mug. So days 21 through 30. I've seen a lot of people go through addiction and addiction treatment. I've spent a lot of time in those places, actually, looking at it, researching. I've got friends in that community. I'm close with that community. One thing I've seen over and over again, sadly, often in the same individuals, is they get sober from whatever. They're doing great. These are people with families. These are people that you discard your normal image of an addict and insert the most normal, typical, whatever, healthy person you can imagine, because a lot of these people you wouldn't know were addicts. And then all of a sudden, you get this call. So-and-so's back in jail. So-and-so's wife is going to leave him because he drank 2 bottles of wine and took a Xanax at 7 a.m., crashed his truck into a pole. It's got 2 beautiful kids. Like, how did this happen again? To the point where by the 4th and 5th time, people are just done. I mean, maybe people, you might be able to detect the frustration in my voice. I'm dealing with this with somebody that's like, I don't even know that I want to help this time. It's been so many times. To the point where I'm starting to wonder, is this person just an addict? This is just kind of what they do and who they are. And you never want to give up on people, but and I'm hanging in there for them. But I will say that many people have given up on them. And so what I'd like to talk about in this context is what sorts of things help other people that we know that are addicted. What really helps? Like not what could help, but what really helps. And are there certain people for whom it's hopeless? I mean, I don't like to hold the conversation that way, but I wouldn't be close to the real life data if I didn't ask. Is it hopeless? Are there people who just will not be able to quit their substance use or their addictive behavior, despite, I have to assume, really wanting to?
Yeah, so there are people who will die of their disease of addiction, and I think conceptualizing it as a disease is a helpful frame. There are other frames that you could use, but I do think given the brain physiologic changes that occur with sustained heavy drug use and what we know happens to the brain, it is really reasonable to think of it as a brain disease. And for me, the real window of, let's say, being able to access my compassion around people who are repeat relapsers, even when their life is so much better, when they're in recovery. Yeah, it's like a no-brainer, right? Is to conceptualize this balance and the dopamine deficit state and a balance tilted to the side of pain, and to imagine that for some people, after a month or 6 months or maybe even 6 years, their balance is still tipped to the side of pain, that on some level that balance has lost its resilience and its ability to restore homeostasis.
It's almost like the hinge on that balance is messed up.
Exactly. And so, I mean, for someone who's never experienced addiction like yourself, maybe one way to conceptualize it is...
Well, I didn't say that.
Oh, okay.
No, I was not, to be clear, I was not referring to myself, but I in this example I was given, if I were, I would come clean. I would reveal that. But I think that, especially after hearing some of your lectures and descriptions of the range of things that are addictive, I think... I've been fortunate I don't have a propensity for drugs or alcohol.
Right, okay.
I'm lucky in that way that, frankly, if they remove all the alcohol from the planet, I'll just be relieved because no one will offer it to me.
Right.
So don't send me any alcohol. It won't go to me.
Right.
But I don't have that. I like to think I have the compassion, but I don't have that empathy for, taking a really good situation and what from the outside looks to be throwing it in the trash.
Yeah. So let me, and this is really, I think, important because I also had to come to an understanding of this, and I feel that I have in my 20 years of seeing these patients. And of course, addiction is a spectrum disease, right? So you've got the severe end of things. Imagine that you had an itch somewhere on your body, okay? And it was, we've all had that, whatever the source. It was super, super itchy. You can go for, if you really focus, you could go for a pretty good amount of time not scratching it. But the moment you stopped focusing on not scratching it, you would scratch it. And maybe you do it while you were asleep, right? And that is what happens to people with severe addiction. That balance is essentially broken. Homeostasis does not get restored despite sustained abstinence. They're living with that constant specter of that pull, it never goes away. So let me say there are lots of people with addiction for whom that does go away, and it goes away at 4 weeks for many of them. But in severe cases, that's always there, and it's lingering, and it's the moment when they're not focusing on not using, it's like a reflex. They fall back into it. It's not purposeful. It's not because they want to get high. It's not because they value using drugs more than they do their family. None of that. It's that really they cannot not do it when given the opportunity and that moment when they're not thinking about it. Does that make sense?
That's a great description, and actually in that description I can feel a bit of empathy, because the way you describe scratching an itch in your sleep.
Yeah.
You know, I've done that with mosquito bites in summer. You're scratching, you're like, you wake up scratching that mosquito bite. And I also have to admit that I've experienced not feeling like I want to pick up my phone because it's so rewarding, but just finding myself doing it.
Yes, of course.
Like, I'm not going to use this thing, I'm not going to use this thing.
Right.
And then just finding myself doing it. Like, what am I doing here?
Right.
Sort of how did I get back here again?
Right.
And I know enough about brain function to understand that we have circuits that generate deliberate behavior, and we have circuits that generate reflexive behavior. And one of the goals of the nervous system is to make the deliberate stuff reflexive, so you don't have to make the decision, because decision making is a very costly thing to do.
Exactly.
Decision making of any kind.
Right.
So that does really help. I want to just try and weave together this this dopamine puzzle, however, because if by week, so first phase of this 30 or 40 day detox, it's like a dopamine fast.
Right.
Okay. First 10 days are miserable. Middle 10 days, the clouds are out. There may be some shards of sunlight coming through, and then all of a sudden, sun starts to come out. It gets brighter and brighter. Why is it then that people will relapse, not just after getting fired from a job or their spouse leaving them, but when things are going really well? Is it this unconscious mechanism? Because I've seen this before. They have a great win. I have a friend who's a really impressive creative. I don't want to reveal any more than that, but and relapsed upon getting another really terrific opportunity to create for the entire world. And I was like, how can that happen? But now I'm beginning to wonder, was it the dopamine associated with that win that opened the spigot on this dopamine system? Because it happened in a phase of a really great stretch of life.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so you raised that great point about triggers, right? And triggers are things that make us want to go back to using our drug. And the key thing about triggers, whatever they are, is they also release a little bit of dopamine, right? So just thinking about whatever the trigger is that we associate with drug use, or just thinking about drug use, can already release this anticipatory dopamine, this little mini spike. But here's the part that I think is really fascinating. That mini spike is followed by a mini deficit state. So it goes up, and then it doesn't go back down to baseline, it goes below baseline tonic levels. And that's craving, right? So that anticipation is immediately followed by wanting the drug, and it's that dopamine deficit state that drives the motivation to go and get the drug. So many people talk about dopamine is not really about pleasure, but about wanting and about motivation. And so it is that deficit state that then drives the locomotion to get it.
And earlier, your description of dopamine being involved in the desire for more, giving the sense of reward, but also movement.
Right.
I have to assume that those things are braided together in our nervous system for the specific intention of when you feel something good, then you feel the pain. Maybe you don't notice it, and then the next thing you know, you're pursuing more of the thing.
And I love the way you use the word braided together. That's beautiful. And let me also just say something that I find also fascinating in my work with patients, and I see this all the time. There are people for whom bad life experiences, loss, in any form, stress in many different forms, that's a trigger. But there are absolutely people for whom the trigger is things going well. And the things going well can be like the reward of things going well, but very often what it is the removal of the hypervigilant state that's required to keep their use in check. So it's this sense of, I want to celebrate, or this reward happened, I want to put more reward on there. And it's really, really fascinating because when people come to that realization about themselves, that they're most vulnerable when things are going well, that's really a valuable insight, because then they can put some, things in place or barriers in place or go to more meetings or whatever it is that they do, to protect themselves.
Along those lines, I have a friend, 40 years sober, who was a severe drug and alcohol addict from a very young age. Really impressive person. Does a lot of important work in the kind of at-risk youth community out in Hawaii. And he said something to me. He said, as former addicts often do, they've got these great sayings. But I think it fits very well with what you're describing. He said, no matter how far you drive, you're always the same distance from the ditch. And I said, well, that's kind of depressing. And he said, no, that's actually what gives me peace. Because what would happen is, for so many years of relapsing and relapsing, recovering and relapsing, he felt like it was hopeless. And then somehow conceptualizing that the vigilance can never go away, instead of making him feel burdened, it made him feel relieved. So I often think about that statement, no matter how far you drive, you're always the same distance from the ditch. Because in my mind, I conceptualize that as, gosh, that's a tough way to drive down the road. But actually, on a road where you know where the ditch is and where you know where the lane lines are, it's actually a pretty nice drive. It's when you don't know where the shoulder is that you constantly have to be looking around. So there's this, we're speaking now in analogies and imagery, and science, but one of the things I find so incredible about this community of 12-step, and there are a variety of them, are the communities that they create for themselves, and some of these sayings, which I do believe link back to really core biological mechanisms.
Yes.
I do want to ask about those communities. I have a question which might be a little bit controversial,
Great.
Which is it possible that people who were addicted to drugs or alcohol or some gambling or some other behavior get addicted to the addiction community? Because one thing that I think I observe over and over is that there's some circuit in the brain of human beings that has to tell you about the dream they had the night before, for whatever reason. There's another circuit that leads people to wake you up if they themselves can't sleep. I don't know what circuit it is. I'm being facetious here. But there does seem to also be a circuit in the brain of addicts to discuss and want to kind of talk about their recovery a lot. And I mention this not to poke at them, but rather the opposite, because I think that one thing that is challenging, at least for me and having friends that have a propensity for drug or alcohol addiction, not all of them, but certainly some of them, is when they're talking about the recovery, I feel like it's all they talk about. This meeting, that meeting, that way. How are we? So what I'm really asking here is that can we become addicted to sobriety?
Right. So this is a great question, and it links into some of the other things we've been talking about, having to do with where do we settle out? What is the way to live between pleasure and pain? And I implied earlier that ultimately we want a resilient balance that's sensitive to pleasure and pain, but that can easily restore homeostasis after we indulge, even when we indulge greatly. But the truth of the matter is that people with severe addiction, I believe, temperamentally want those extremes, and they're wired for that kind of intensity that is more than just these slight adjustments around the fulcrum, right? It's like they want the big highs and the big lows.
They'll say great meeting.
Yeah,
they're like, that was such an amazing meeting. Or they find a group.
Yeah.
They find a group in a location.
Yeah.
Like we see, this is almost an inside joke in those communities. Again, I'm not talking about a friend in quotes. This isn't me reporting. Well, they'll talk about how attractive people are at a given meeting, or how bonded they feel to people at a given meeting. That the meetings themselves become their own form of dopamine hit.
Yes.
And again, I'm not being disparaging. I want to understand this.
Right. So so a lot of times patients will say to me, "Oh, I don't want to go to AA. It's a cult." And my response to that is, because it's a cult is exactly why it works, okay? Because yes, it is much better for you to be addicted to AA and to recovery than almost any other addiction I could think of. And we know from Rob Malenka's work, who's here at Stanford, that oxytocin, is the hormone that's involved in human pair bonding and relationships and love, and it directly links to dopamine neurons and causes the release of dopamine. So yes, when we connect with other humans, especially in a kind of transcendent spiritual way, that's a huge dopamine hit, and it does replace the dopamine that people get from drugs. And for people who have this addiction temperament, they need it on a more intense level. They're not going to be generally satisfied with kind of, a sort of acquaintanceship, right? They want that intensity of the intimacy that you get with people when you're cathartically exposing, warts and all. So yes, people can get addicted to recovery, and good for them. Go for it, And of course, this can be disruptive for friendships and relationships where the one person is not in recovery. Like, you're going to so many meetings, you're always having recovery, but you know what? Much better than them being intoxicated, right? I mean, so although you may tire of your friends talking about their meeting all the time, I'm sure you would rather have them do that than be in their addiction. So
yeah, absolutely. And this is now the second time you've done this during this discussion, but now I have empathy because the way you describe their enthusiasm about meetings is probably the way that people feel about me and work.
Right.
And neuroscience. I mean, I've been getting up in front of the class since I was 8 years old and talking about things I read over the weekend. Now I just happen to have this thing podcast.
Right.
I've been doing it since I was little, and it annoys a lot of people. Right? I've learned to suppress it a little bit. Some people like it, but I'm poking fun at myself just to say that I now can understand that the way I feel about their reports about yet another amazing meeting, or for there's a different form of this, but there's some people for which they just love intense experiences.
Yes.
They're always like trying to pull me off to Bali because they're talking about how sensual it is all the time. I'm sure Bali's wonderful, but there's this kind of ratcheting up. It's like seeking Burning Man all day long. I'm never going to Burning Man. No desire to go to Burning Man. But inside of academia, I mean, if I were to just turn the mirror at myself, inside of academia or here in Silicon Valley, work and the pursuit of more success, even if money is kind of divorced from that. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Academic work is, for sake of pursuit of knowledge. It sounds to me like the same mechanism. In fact, it feels to me very much like the same mechanism.
So Andrew, here's what I love about you. First of all, you're willing to bring your own flaws and foibles to this conversation.
Well, they're everywhere.
Well, you know what? It's wonderful. And then you're really open and curious and wanting to understand. Because I can't tell you how many people I have met who really see addiction as some kind of otherness. But the truth is, we're all wired for addiction. And if you're not addicted yet, it's right around the corner. Do you know what I mean? Especially with the incredible panoply of new drugs and behaviors that are. So I love that you're willing to take a moment and really try to understand this, because it is we can all relate, and you're relating it to essentially your work addiction is right and apt. You just happen to be addicted to something that is really socially rewarded. You figured that out at an early age. Oh, when I do X, Y, and Z, all these people go, look at that smart kid, or whatever it is.
So for me, it made me feel safe.
Okay.
I felt like, I just felt like this, and I paused there because it's like peace. I'm like, I can relax for a moment.
When you're talking about neuroscience.
No, or just when I feel like I'm on the right path.
Yeah.
And I'm onto something, or if I see something that I'm excited about.
Right.
I'm like, I feel filled with dopamine.
Yes.
I feel flooded, but really head to toe.
Yeah.
And then my next thought.
So true. You're a true addict.
Okay,
you are.
thank
You are, but you just got.
I think
you really got lucky with the fact that what you're drawn to is adaptive, essentially. And then your challenge is going to be that your life doesn't get too out of balance in the sense that you're 24/7 work and you don't stop and do some other things or think about it. And
my life admittedly is somewhat asymmetric. I mean, it has other components of physical health, etc., but it is somewhat asymmetric. which is why I got a dog. Although I talk about him an awful lot. So,
but the dog is good because that draws you out of yourself and a little bit of the work. But again, I think the key here is for people who feel like they've never experienced addiction, or they don't know anybody with addiction, or if they do, they don't get it. Just think of that one thing that is the most important thing in your life that you do that gives you pleasure and meaning and purpose, and then imagine if you couldn't do it.
Oh yeah, let's not talk about it.
Right.
Well, I appreciate the feedback and what is the most ridiculous sounding addiction that you've ever witnessed that was actually a real addiction along these lines? Because I think we all know the standard heroin pill. You've been I should mention, because it's important, your previous book, and we will provide a link to that as well, focused on the opioid crisis, and what we thought was medication turned out to be just as bad, if not worse, than a lot of so-called street drugs. So we understand those gambling, sex addiction, porn addiction, now video games. We'll talk about social media a little bit more in depth. But what's the most, wow, I didn't realize people could get addicted to that.
Water.
Really?
Really. So I had a very lovely patient who had a severe alcohol addiction, and she got into recovery from her alcohol addiction for many years, but she kind of had a sort of a polydipsia, or an urge to be drinking something a lot. And so she drank a lot of water, and slowly over time, she realized that if she drank enough water, she could become hyponatremic and delirious and be out of herself. Right, which is, she just wanted to be out of her own head. And so she would periodically, intentionally overdose on water in order, to, I know it was so sad.
What happened to her?
She eventually took her own life. Wow. Yeah,
that's rough.
She was a lovely woman. She was so bright. She had so many interests and passions, and of course it was very sad, when she died. But that was a wow to me. It was like, wow, if you have this disease of addiction, you can even get addicted to water.
Wow. And I think it just underscores the generalizability of these circuits.
Right.
There isn't a brain circuit for addiction to water that she happened to have. There's a brain circuit for pleasure and pain and addiction, and water for binge.
Right.
Wow, that's intense. In your book, Dopamine Nation, you also describe some amazing paths to recovery. People that, from reading it, I won't say which ones and who, because there's some great surprises in the book too, both tragic and triumphant, as they say. You've often described your patients. Tell us about it.
When you think about how hard it is to give up a drug or a behavior that you're addicted to, how much courage that takes, and fortitude and discipline and stick-to-itiveness, these people are really amazing people. I mean, I don't know that I could do it, what they do, it's, and like we talked a little bit about, just the constant, ever-present urge to use, even after sustained periods of abstinence for some people. That's really, really hard. And of course, then you double down on the shame that they feel because of that urge, even when their lives are so much better. I mean, these people are really, really remarkable. And you take their remarkable accomplishment, and then you imagine the world that we live in now, where we are constantly invited and tempted and really bombarded with opportunities to become addicted.
It's like feeling an itch everywhere.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can't escape it. You cannot escape it. You're getting email in your inbox inviting you to do X, Y, or Z. And if you're addicted to that thing, you try to delete all your apps, all of a sudden your work inbox, you're getting those images, let's say. Really, really, really hard. And yet these people find a way to do it. I think it's absolutely amazing. And they're really wise people. They have so much wisdom to offer. They taught me a lot. As I talk about in my book, I have my own addictions, and I really just took a page right out of their book. I was like, okay, what do I do now? All right, what did this patient do? Okay, I'm going to try that.
It is an amazing community.
Yeah.
Of people that are very sage. I wanted to just touch on something that you mentioned, which is shame. You can't go to a meeting or talk to addicts without detecting or hearing about like lies, shame, etc. I heard you say in an interview with somebody else recently that truth-telling and secrets are sort of at the core of recovery. And tell us more about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I found really fascinating about working with people in recovery was how telling the truth, even about the merest detail of their lives, was central to their recovery. And I became really curious about that. Like, why would truth-telling be so important? And of course, there is the obvious thing that when people are in their addiction, they're lying about using, so part of getting into recovery is to stop lying to the people they care about their use. But it's really more than that, because what people in recovery have taught me is that it's not even just not lying about using drugs. I have to not lie about anything. I can't lie about why I was late to work this morning, which we all do. Oh, I hit traffic. No, I didn't hit traffic. I wanted to spend 2 more minutes reading the paper and drinking my coffee, right? Or just lying about, I don't know, where I had dinner. So people with addiction will get into, the lying habit where they're lying about random stuff because they're sort of in the habit of lying. And how recovery is really about telling the truth, in all ways. And so one of the things that I had a lot of fun with in writing the book is sort of exploring the neuroscience around why truth-telling is important to leading a balanced life. And we know every religion since the beginning of time is all about telling the truth. Well, why, right? And there's really interesting neuroscience that suggests that when we tell the truth, we actually potentially strengthen our prefrontal cortical circuits and their connections to our limbic brain and our reward brain. And of course, these are the circuits that get disconnected when we're in our addiction, right? Our balance in our reward pathway, our limbic brain, our emotion brain is doing one thing, and our cortical circuits are completely disengaged from that, ignoring what's happening, which is easy to do because it's reflexive. We don't need to think about that balance for the balance to be happening. But we have to re-engage those circuits, anticipate future consequences, think through the drink, not just how am I going to feel now if I use, but how am I going to feel tomorrow or 6 months from now. And that telling the truth is in fact a way to do that, to make these connections stronger. And I talk about some studies in my book that kind of indirectly show that. So I find that really fascinating. Plus, that being open and honest with people really does create very intimate connections, and those intimate connections create dopamine. So we were talking a little bit about how you know a bunch of people who need intensity in their lives. For me, I need a lot of intensity in my human connections. I'm really not interested in and bored by and made anxious by casual interactions, but having this kind of discussion with you that's very intense and also intimate and self-disclosing is very rewarding for me. So that's an important source of dopamine. Thank God I became a psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right? Absolutely.
Right. I can't disclose all my stuff, but I am quite transparent with my patients, which is slightly unorthodox. But when I think it's right, I'm also transparent with them. So that's a source of dopamine too, when we're honest and we disclose, and that you think people are going to run away from you if you tell them about all your weird neuroses, but really they don't. What they're like is, oh, thank God, I'm not the only one, right?
Well, what I love many things about your book. I read it in one sweep, and I was like, wow, I was pleasantly surprised, but I was like, wow, she's really opening up in this book from the very beginning. And I don't want to give it away, but you're very open where it's appropriate, and also I think that this question about truth telling, I always think about tell the truth, be 100% about the truth, but there's also this element about, do you report previous lies, right? What about prior behavior? And I'm fascinated by this because to me, telling the truth has many facets, but the three sides of this thing in my mind are: one is reporting everything accurately, The other is, what do you withhold, what do you not withhold, right? Because some people say, tell the truth or at least don't lie. That's sort of a...
Lies of omission,
yes,
right?
Lies of omission. Lies of omission. And then there's what I have to assume for most people is a small to enormous batch of things that they lied about in the past that still thread into the future. Right. So how important is it for the addict or every person really to, because it sounds like cultivating the circuitry between the prefrontal cortex and the dopamine system would be great for anybody. Since we're all addicts,
right.
Everyone should do it. But in all seriousness, it sounds like a good thing for everybody to do. How much work needs to be done on all the priors, all the stuff? I mean, not me, but all the stuff that everybody else is.
Yeah. So the steps of the 12 steps about thoughts and feelings. A good number of those steps are about that very thing, the past, the ways that we harmed people in the past. And the fourth step is about making amends, by admitting the ways in which that we've contributed to harming others, and it's a really big piece of recovery. So, how important, so for people with addiction, it's really, really important to go back and make amends. And, the key idea there is you just go back and you apologize, and you don't have to get any particular kind of response, or you don't need to be forgiven. It's the act itself of apologizing about the ways in which we harmed or lied to people in the past that is cathartic and renewing and allows us to kind of shed the skin and be new in our lives and sort of exalt so it is really important. Are there situations when it's maybe not a good idea because of that person? Sure. There are always going to be, it doesn't have to be like, it's not, we're talking about like Kant's idea about it, never lie, but robbers in your house and you're a stowaway. You can't lie even about that. It's like, no, there are probably situations where,
for sake of other people's sake.
Right.
Children's sake.
Right. I mean, there you can think of a million scenarios, but in general, when we're taking stock, because I don't know about you, but I have a lot of regrets and guilt about a lot of things in my life. And they kind of haunt me. Sometimes I'll have nightmares, right? And I think that's true for most people. I mean, I occasionally will meet somebody who's like, oh, I don't have any regrets in my life. And I'm like, wow. Like, I cannot relate to that at all. So, this idea of like catharsis and, in the 12 steps, it's telling God or your higher power, telling another human being the ways in which you've wronged others, considering your own character defects and how those have contributed. To me, that's a really important piece and something that we don't do enough in our current culture, especially in psychiatry, frankly, where there's a lot of eternally empathizing with patients, but not a whole lot of like going, actually, you kind of messed that up, or like, that was really bad on you, and in my work, I don't necessarily use that language, but, patients may say like, I really feel badly about, this thing. I'll be like, yeah, I get it. I understand what you feel.
Well, guilt is
right.
There's a circuit for that too.
Right, and it's important, right? And it's also important to recovery and to not becoming addicted. Just experiencing a certain amount of appropriate shame for things that we have done, and feeling the pain that comes with shame, which is an incredibly painful emotion, right? And I think that may be the one that we all try to avoid more than any other, is like that shame of not being liked or not being accepted or not being celebrated.
The thing that we did is really despicable.
Right. It's really, like, oh my God, I did that horrible thing. Right. And then, so, I've done horrible things that I haven't gone back and said I did this horrible thing, but maybe I've tried to pay it forward. Like I've told my kids, when I was younger, I did this horrible thing, and it still haunts me. So if you're ever tempted to do something like what I did, you might think about my situation. So, some kind of way, but I think wrestling with that is important.
No, I think it's a really important element to all this, and there's not, I love that there's neuroscience being done on truth-telling and the value of truth-telling. I think if I were to predict a new and truly exciting area that people are going to be really curious about, and in this huge sphere we call neuroscience, I hope they'll continue to do more work.
Yeah.
Also speaks to, I'm so glad to hear that's happening here at Stanford.
No, that's the literature that I look at isn't Stanford work, but there's work. There might be people at Stanford.
Regardless of where it's happening,
yeah.
more of that and all the rest, please. I want to ask you about using drugs to treat drug addiction. These days, there's a growing interest, or at least discussion, about ibogaine. People going out of country, because I think it's still illegal here, is illegal here, going out of country to, I don't know, either inject it or smoke it or whatever it is, or people going and doing ayahuasca journeys, or MDMA, which is still an illegal drug in clinical trials. There are people on this campus doing experimental studies. I don't know clinical trials, but at Johns Hopkins there are clinical trials, etc. So this is a vast area, right? Different chemistries for different drugs and different purposes. But the rationale, as I understand it, is take people who are in a pattern of addiction, launch them into a experience that's also chemical and extreme, often of the extreme serotonin and or extreme dopamine type. So MDMA, ecstasy, for instance, tons of serotonin dumped, tons of dopamine dumped. How neurotoxic, if neurotoxic, debatable, et cetera, not a topic for now, but a lot. And then somehow that extreme experience wrapped inside of a supported network in there, whether or not there's just someone there or whether or not they're actively working through something, the patient is supposed to eject the person into a life where drug use isn't as much of interest. This violates, at a purely rational level, this violates everything we've talked about in terms of dopamine biology. It would, if this arrangement is the way I described it, cause more addiction. It is anything but a dopamine fast. It's a dopamine feast. So we hear about successful transition through this. Maybe some what is going on? What is going on? Doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. So I think it's good that you're skeptical. I think we all should be skeptical. Having said that, there are clinical studies showing, these are small studies and they're short duration, small number of subjects. But taking people, for example, who are addicted to alcohol, and then having them have this, let's say, psychedelic experience in a very controlled setting.
So either typically it's a high dose psilocybin or 3-dose, as I saw it for the MAP study of MDMA.
Right.
Those are sort of seem to be the kind of
typical,
bread and butter of this kind of work.
Right. But the thing to really keep in mind is that this is completely interwoven with regular psychotherapy, and that these are highly selected individuals.
And clinical trials.
Right. And these are clinical trials. Right. And so I think the metaphor that helps me think about this is there are many ways to the top of the mountain, and these are sort of like taking a gondola instead of walking up. It's sort of, instead of doing like a year of psychoanalysis where you're sitting on the couch every week reflecting on your life, it's a condensed version of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy plus, MDMA, which gets you there faster.
Creates the intimacy, presumably, because of this.
Well, I think the main thing that happens when it's beneficial is it just allows the person to get outside of their own head and look at their lives on a much broader scope, and to consider themselves not mired in the quotidian sort of details of their life, but rather as a human on the in the vast universe. So I think it's like when it works, it's a transformational experience because it gives the person another lens through which to view their lives, which I think for some people is positive and powerful, because they can come back from that and be like, oh my gosh, I care about my family, and I want X, Y, or Z for them, and I realize that my continuing to drink is not going to, achieve that. So it's almost like a spiritual or values-based. So I think it can be very powerful. But having said that, I truly am quite skeptical, because addiction is a chronic relapsing and remitting problem. It's hard for me to imagine that there's something that works very quickly, short term, that's going to work for a disease that's really long lasting.
Yeah, the two addicts I know that did MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as part of this thing both got worse.
Yeah.
But the people I know who had severe trauma, who took this approach, seem to be doing better.
Okay.
And so I think that the discussion as we hear it now is just sort of psychedelics, which is a huge category that includes many different drugs and compounds with different effects. And we hear about trauma and addiction lumped together. And I think that I'm a splitter, not a lumper, as we say in science. And I think it's going to be important for people to know that this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, but it sounds like it may have some utility under certain conditions.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm trying to be very open-minded about its potential utility for certain individuals, but I can tell you in my clinical work what is a very concerning unintended consequence of this narrative is I have a lot of people who are looking for some kind of spiritual awakening who on their own, not in the context of any kind of therapeutic psychological work, microdose or want to try, psilocybin or MDMA with a friend or wherever, so they can have this, spiritual experience that they can figure out their lives. That's a disaster, and almost never works out well. And I've then had people who literally, supposedly you can't get addicted to psychedelics because, something with the biochemistry, which I don't fully understand because it doesn't make any sense to me. But I have patients clinically who definitely are addicted to, MDMA, to microdosing. So that's very concerning to me because, Pollen's How to Change Your Mind, I respect that work, but on the other hand, it's penetrated the culture.
Michael Pollan's book.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't know him, and so I don't have a problem taking a stance. So I'll just say my stance on that is the narrative of popular authors can expand and wick out so fast that pretty soon people are essentially taking their mental health into their own hands.
Right.
And I actually have great optimism for this business of clinical use of psychedelics. Matthew Johnson at Johns Hopkins is doing fabulous work on this. And there are others too, of course. But those are controlled settings.
Right.
And the pharmacology is being tuned up. And one thing that I think is coming, there are several papers published recently in great journals like Nature and Science, etc., where there are scientists who are removing the hallucinogenic components of these drugs and finding that they still have the antidepressant effects. And so the experience of a psychedelic and the long-term effects of the psychedelic might actually be dissociative. And so, again, and I'm always careful to say I'm neither for something or against it. I just think that treading carefully is what's important.
I agree with you, and I can just tell you that the downstream effect for the average person, for many of whom present in our clinic, is that they've misconstrued the data on the use of psychedelics for mental health conditions to this idea that they're safe or that anybody can take them in any circumstance and have this kind of awakening. That's not what the data show. The data are these highly controlled settings, carefully selected patients. So that's my worry,
Sure. And I'm going to be sitting down with Matthew Johnson at some point, and we'll discuss this. And I think that that care and that cocoon of real clinical care does seem to be an important component. Well, I'm glad we could touch on it, and I'm sure I'll get a bunch of comments telling me, but I think it is important to explore things from all sides, and that's what we do as scientists. And if Michael Pollan wants to chat, we can do that too. That's fine. I very much enjoyed the book, actually, but I think that people run with ideas.
That's right.
They don't walk with them; they sprint.
Right.
There are a couple other things I just want to touch on, but they all relate to social media.
Okay.
You were featured in The Social Dilemma. It was a powerful movie. I think many people avoided seeing that movie because it reflects back on us just how addicted we all are and how manipulated we all are.
Yes.
But it doesn't seem to have changed behavior much. I have to say that the movie changed my understanding and my perception, but not my behavior too much. If we look at addiction as a maladaptive thing, something that's making our lives worse or us less functional at work and in relationships, I could imagine a version of social media where it's making me more connected. I mean, this is a podcast after all. I post videos. This will show up on YouTube and elements of it on Instagram as well. So much like sugar or other things, I have to imagine that we need to regulate, not necessarily eliminate this behavior. So I want to talk about what that looks like now. And I want to talk about what you've referred to as this narcissistic preoccupation that social media is creating, that we are all far more keenly aware of how we look and how we sound and how we are being perceived than we were 10 years ago.
Right.
So first of all, social media, how addicting is it really? And what is healthy social media behavior?
So the first message I would want to get across about social media is that it really is a drug, and it's engineered to be a drug. And it's based on, potency, quantity, variety, the bottomless bowls, the likes, the way that it's enumerated, all of that. Which doesn't mean that we can't use it, but we need to be very thoughtful about the way we use it, just like we need to be thoughtful about the way we use any drug. And so that means with intention and in advance, planning our use, right, and trying to use it as a really awesome tool to potentially connect with other people and not to be used by it or get lost in it. And of course, people are going to come with different propensities for addiction to any drug, and that's true for social media too. Some people will have no problem using it in moderation or using it in a way that's adaptive, and other people will immediately get sucked in. And the key thing about getting addicted is when it's happening, nobody who's getting addicted thinks they're getting addicted, right? Let's face it. It's only after the fact that we go, whoops, what was that about?
Well, remember texting and driving? There were all these books about texting and driving, how terrible it was.
Yeah.
Even the governments have largely given up. You see these billboards,
terrifying.
like don't text and drive, or any text can wait, or not worth dying for.
Right. And if you look at young people, teenagers, they're basically cybernetically enhanced. The phone is there, it's like they're talking to you and texting 12 friends at the same time. And there's no stopping it. I mean, the genie is out of the bottle where, we're not going back, So we do need to figure out, how to make this tool something that's going to be good for us and not ultimately harmful. And I don't have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think some of the wisdom that we have learned from using other drugs also applies to social media, which is to say that we have to, again, put barriers in place that allow us to remain in control of our use, which means not too much, not too often, not too potent.
Do you think, in going back to this idea of the unit of the day being a good tractable unit, a manageable unit of time for most people, so you're saying in advance, so allocating 2 hours in which you're going to allow yourself to have pre-written things, or even more restricted than that, meaning, okay, I'm giving myself 30 minutes a day to post and comment, and then that's a closeout completely.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the person, and it's sort of a combination. We talked earlier about, having an itch and scratching yourself at night. We've gotten to a point with smartphones, people are pulling them out, and they are utterly unconscious of doing so. Pulling them out, a couple texts, a couple swipe. They don't know they're doing it.
I have a friend who works in, delivers babies.
Yeah.
And many pregnant mothers won't actually deliver without their phone in hand. And this used to be the hand that was connected to their spouse. This may be a comment on spouses more than on phones, but it sounds like it's a kind of a security blanket.
Right, like a transitional object.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me. You've referred to the phone. I think it's the phone, but maybe it's our online persona or ourselves as we've become sort of infantile in our need for it. It's like a baby in a bottle. And so I do wonder if we have regressed, and I do think we've regressed a bit in terms of our online behavior, our inability to act like, I always thought an adult was somebody that can control their behavior.
Yeah.
That's the difference between a baby and an adult. You don't have to be a developmental neurobiologist for very long to understand that a young organism can't control its behavior and an older one can. So to me, a mature organism, mature in years organism that can't control its behavior is a baby. It's an immature version of itself. And there's neuroscience to support that statement. I look at my own behavior with the phone sometimes and I think, I'm a grown man. Like, what is the problem here, right? I don't eat baby food, but I'm acting like a baby with the phone, all right? In the sense that I'm reflexively picking it up. I'm not being intentionally deliberate with it. Do I need a full 30 days, Anna?
So 30
days away from my
as
phone.
That's my recommended full 30 days to reset. I think, if you're severely addicted, I recommend 30 days. But if you're just a little bit addicted, like most of us, you probably don't need 30 days. In fact, a single day not only would be challenging, but probably maybe sufficient.
My phone is off for substantial segments.
Okay, that's great.
And it drives other people crazy. People expect me to respond, but I don't care. I really don't.
Right.
And I actually take a little bit of pleasure in the fact that, because I think the point I'm trying to make is the right one, which is that it's not just right for me, but why? I don't see a clause on text messages or emails that say, must be responded to within X amount of time or else.
Yeah.
So I take the liberty of replying when I'm able to.
Yeah, that's right.
Or want to.
Right. Which touches on one of the big challenges about social media is that as more and more of us are spending more and more time on social media, we're divesting our libidinous energies, etc., from real life interactions. So that means even when we want to choose to not be online connecting, we go outside and there's no there, right? There's nobody else there. So I think our collective challenge, and it should be our mission, is to make sure that we are preserving and maintaining offline ways to connect with each other. Because if we don't do that, then we'll be very lonely, right, if we were not online. But if you have a tribe of folks that you can be with, none of whom are on their phones while you're together for that discrete amount of time, then it's wonderful and liberating. Nobody's distracted. And I think that's really the key. And I think young people are figuring that out, They're trying to create these spaces or try to, let's say, instead of doing a dopamine fast by yourself, do it with your friends, right? Then there's the FOMO is less if you're missing out because you're all doing the dopamine fast together. So these are some of the tricks that we can come up with. But
I like that.
Yeah. Okay.
I like
good.
That. I don't allow. I have a home gym, and I love working out. I just enjoy it, and always have. And I don't allow my phone in my gym anymore.
Right.
And I live in an area where I don't get any reception, like 2 meters outside my door. So all my dog walks now are just with the dog, and they were boring as hell. I also have a bulldog. He doesn't like to walk. It's really slow. And it was so boring for me.
Yes.
Because I was so used to taking calls while I was walking. It's super efficient. Why wouldn't I do that? The walks now are some of my favorite part of the day. Because if the phone were, if I were to get a call on one of those and they brought reception to the area, I would be very dismayed.
Right.
So I can attest to this, and I don't think I'm a phone addict, but I do put work
Yes, so this is the key. You have to, with intention, prior to being in that situation, think of literal physical and metacognitive barriers that you can put between yourself and your phone or whatever your drug is, to create these intentional spaces where you're not constantly interrupting yourself, essentially, and distracting yourself. Because I really do think, I think we talked just before we started with the interview, we're losing the ability to have a sustained thought, right? I mean, we get so far, and then you get to that point in the thought where it's a little bit hard to know what's coming next. And it's very easy to check your phone or check your email or look something up on, the internet. And then you never get that opportunity to finish that thought, which is really the source of creative energy and an original thought, right? You're not just reacting to
right, and something that can contribute to the world.
That's right.
I'm a big believer that you're either consuming or you are creating.
Right.
And there is, I should mention, it's important. I do believe in neutral time. I think sleep is great. I'm a big proponent of sleep and talk a lot about it on the podcast. I care a lot about sleep. And not just for sake of performance. Actually, just really like sleep. I think that being a constant consumer of visual information and information of all kinds can be a problem. But there's some really great sources of information, and I certainly benefit from the fact that those channels exist. Narcissistic preoccupation. Am I a narcissist?
First of all, there's healthy.
Or is the fact that I asked, does that take me out of? Would a narcissist never ask that question?
Oh yes, a highly sophisticated narcissist would know to do
I'm not
that.
very sophisticated.
So there's healthy narcissism, which means that we all invest our personal energies into things that we care about. And if our competence in that arena is threatened, we would all experience a narcissistic injury, and that's normal and healthy. But we are living in a narcissistic culture. I mean, that's not news. This preoccupation with individual achievement and individual self-worth and individual self-confidence. And I think all of that is fueled by social media, where we're not just seeing ourselves, but we're seeing people's reactions to ourselves, and every single, thing we say or do, we get likes and this and that. It's really insidious, and it contributes, I think, to a lot of personal shame, because we're not really meant to be individuals bouncing around in the universe. We're social animals, and we're probably generally happiest, even for natural contrarians among us, when we're part of a tribe, right? And if we do too much to kind of separate ourselves from that tribe, I think that the brain's natural and instinctive corrective mechanism against that is self-loathing and shame. So, it's so ironic, because the culture tells us if we just achieve more, we'll like ourselves more. But the truth is actually the opposite. That I think when people get these pinnacles of personal achievement, you have things like the imposter syndrome or whatever,
Where you just, we're at Stanford after a lot of high achievers here.
Right.
It's amazing people like yourself and other colleagues of mine. I'm always in awe. It's just amazing. Like, the mean is shifted so high, and also people who have amazing paths to get here, coming from very little, accomplishing so much. But it's also the pressure, right? The way that this career was described to me, one colleague of mine, the late said, "Welcome to schizophrenia, because you're never going to be able to complete anything without getting interrupted." That was partially true, although I've created buffers. And the other one, very successful scientist, a member of the National Academy, etc., said to me, just remember, it's pinball. You never win. The best you can do is just keep playing.
Yes.
And I thought, wow. Okay. And then you just go.
Right.
But I think that as we achieve more, not just academics, of course, but as anyone achieves more, there's the relishing in the accomplishment. There's often the desire for more, but there's also the pressure of, well, now I have to do this for the next 30 years, even though I love it. It's the pressure of, well, if the mountain is this high, then how do I get here and here and here? And then you start shoveling more dirt on so you can keep climbing. And it's a lot of work.
Yes.
And I think that the perception of success is that there's a roar of the crowd and you cruise. You don't cruise. They just give you more to do.
Right.
Or you give yourself more to do.
Well, what I think is, at least in my life experience, and I've heard this from other people as well, it's that prize that we're going for that if we get it is so unsatisfying. And it's the prize that we never imagined that we kind of go, well, how did that happen? But gee, that feels good. And so I'm very, it's curious, what's the
It's like a mirage in the one case, and it's like it's on the one. It's almost like dopamine can create these mirages.
Yes.
That there's some place.
That's
there.
right. And if I just, it's that pot of gold, right? If I just,
constant dopamine.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think this, this really, I think, is related to our discussion earlier about this taking it one day at a time, or paying attention to that, 24-hour period in your environment. I am absolutely fascinated by the ways in which we accumulate success when we do that, totally independent of the desire for success. It's really process oriented. It's like, where am I today? How can I make today a good and meaningful day, a little bit better or as good as some other days I've had? Constantly tweaking and experimenting with this experiment that we call, our human existence. And when we do that in a way that's authentic and paying attention and value-driven, whatever our, values are informed by, it is very, very interesting how those days, again, accumulate, and you find, well, I guess I contributed something of value there, but I wasn't trying to do that. I think that's really, what I'm so amazed by is 20 years ago when I went to Stanford Medical School, 25 years ago, I was happy to just be a good doctor. I was like, I guess I'm just going to try to figure out how to be a good doctor, and I'm here to learn that. And now I see these medical students, and they're wonderful. They're brilliant, and they're well-intentioned, all that. But they're like, how can I, write the great American novel, do my startup, go to Africa, apply for that grant? It's like, really? I was just trying to learn how to be a doctor. And it's, as you say, it's a lot of pressure on them. And it's also kind of a weird leapfrogging of the real way to accomplish something.
Right.
Which isn't about like, oh, how can I accomplish something? It's like, what can I do today that would be of service, right? And then finding that of trying to be of service, and not really going for recognition can sometimes lead to what people call success, although that wasn't what you were aiming for.
And it's all the more beautiful when it's not what you're aiming for.
Oh, so much better. So much better.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that when one can align their compulsion with some greater good, the service to humanity or the planet or animals, whatever it is, that's where the really good stuff emerges, because there's a lot of reciprocity there. The world starts to, you're supporting the world, and then it starts to support you in a way that feels very fluid.
And that comes back.
Yeah.
Right, and that speaks to your generosity to me vis-a-vis my book. And I have to say,
I love the book.
I know
There's like, we're not in a business deal, folks. It's just purely that I heard Anna lecture in my course. I wanted to learn more about dopamine. She taught me. I asked her if she would come on the podcast. Turned out she wrote this amazing book. She sent me an advance copy of the book. I read it in one sweep. It's incredible, and I love it. So just like the 8-year-old version of me, now the 45 version of myself, I can't stop blabbing about the things I love.
Well, it's awesome, but I have to say I have been surprised by your generosity. It's not something I've encountered frequently at Stanford, which is a wonderful place, but I am honored. There is a general sense that if I give away to somebody else, I've lost something. Which is not the right way to think about it, not how you are, and also not how the world works, because when we give away to other people, we get back so much more, but it takes a long time, and it might not come through that path.
I never think about reciprocity.
Yeah.
but I was weaning by good advisors.
That's very nice.
I think I just sort of got drilled into me that the more you give, the better your immediate life is.
Yes. Yeah.
But I also don't have a long-term vision. I'm just excited about the book. I'm excited that people are learning about the brain and dopamine. I have to admit, having grown up in neuroscience, essentially, I did not understand that pleasure and pain were orchestrated the way that they are. I'm very mindful of it now.
Oh, good.
And it's changed a number of my behaviors. I know a number of people are going to have questions and want to get in contact with you. You are not on social media.
That's correct. Yes.
You are true to your ideology. That's great.
And the reason for that is just I wouldn't be able to control myself. I mean, that really would be my drug. People are my drug. Intimacy is my drug, and I wouldn't be able to manage it. And so it was just easier for me to not do it at all rather than try to moderate it.
Well, the book, as you mentioned before, and as I can attest to, is it has a certain intimacy. People get to know you through the book. So definitely check out the book. If you have questions about the book, etc., you're welcome to send them my way. I will buffer you from all those questions. I'll filter them. And Dr. Lemke, I should be formal. Forgive me, I've been referring to him the whole way through because we're colleagues. But thank you so much for sharing this information. And I know I learned a ton, and I know everyone else is going to learn a lot more about addiction and the good side.
That's right. Thank you for having me. It's been really, really great to talk with you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for joining me for my discussion with Dr. Anna Lemke. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Please be sure to check out her new book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. You can pre-order it on Amazon or any places where books are sold. It's an absolutely fascinating and engaging read, all about addiction and dopamine. If you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please follow us on YouTube by subscribing to the Huberman Lab channel. In addition, you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple and Spotify. And on Apple, you have the opportunity to leave us up to a 5-star review. If you have comments or suggestions for topics for a future podcast, please put those in the comments section below this episode on YouTube. In addition, we have a Patreon. That's patreon.com/Andrew Huberman, and there you can support us at any level that you like. Please also check out our sponsors that we mentioned at the beginning of the episode. That's a terrific way to support our podcast and our ability to continue to bring you zero-cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools. And last but not least, thank you for your interest in science.
We're not being truthful with ourselves if we are pretending like this is not a huge problem. This is a huge problem.
About addiction, substance addiction, of course, but also addiction more broadly. How, as the world has kind of evolved from one of scarcity to one of overabundance, and we increasingly orient our lives around the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, we are setting ourselves up for a myriad of unprecedented types of addiction, and consequently, the pain we so desperately seek to avoid. My guest for this exploration is Dr. Anna Lemke. Anna is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. A clinician, scholar, and authority on addiction medicine, the neuroscience of addiction, and the opioid crisis. Anna appeared in the Netflix documentary Social Dilemma, which has been widely discussed on this podcast. She's also widely published. She's testified before Congress and has authored 2 important books, Drug Dealer MD, which the New York Times declared one of the top 5 books to read to understand the opioid epidemic, and her newest called Dopamine Nation, right here, which is a powerful primer on how to moderate compulsive overconsumption in a world where, unfortunately, feeling good has become confused with the highest good. this is an important and I think impactful conversation about the nature, the psychology, and the neuroscience of addiction that I think, among other things, will reframe and broaden your sense of what addiction is and is not. And I suspect will hold great value for anyone currently struggling with addiction or close to someone who does, which, let's face it, is almost everybody. So please hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and enjoy my exchange with Dr. Anna Lembke. Anna, so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for traveling down here to do this. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. We were introduced by our mutual friend, Andrew Huberman. Any recommendation from him is one worth noting. He's such a unbelievable mind. He's been a great guest, and he's become a good friend. And, you know, upon his recommendation, the more I've dug into your story and your work, the more excited I got to do this with you. I think you're really the perfect person to have a really, I think, important, impactful conversation around the nature of addiction and kind of the current culture and our relationship to the dopamine-induced world that we now find ourselves in.
Well, first let me say I agree with you 100% on Andrew Huberman. He is, you know, my colleague at Stanford, another professor, but I've seldom met a colleague who so generously was willing to promote someone else's work. And he's been just amazing about Dopamine Nation and trying to help me, you know, get the word out and get it read. And of course, I'm really, really excited to be here and talk to you. It's a real privilege.
Yeah. I mean, so much to talk about. People who listen or watch the show know that I have a personal history with addiction and recovery and sobriety. It's a major theme or topic that recurs on this show. And I think a good place to kind of start with this is to share a little bit, you know, from my personal perspective, when I think back on my emotional state of being when I was at the nadir of my using and facing the prospect of getting sober. I just remember such a deep sense of shame and embarrassment and this sense of just being irreparably broken and being scared of everybody, scared of everything, of the world, and this sense that, you know, really getting honest with myself about the fact that I was an addict really equated to just to being a broken human being and this pathology that it evokes, you know, because my sense was that addicts were, you know, needle fiends and hopeless drunks, and that's kind of where the conversation begins and ends. But as somebody who's been steeped in the recovery community and somebody who's been sober for a little while, I've become increasingly convinced over many years that addiction is so misunderstood and so much more widely prevalent than I think we realize. And also that it exists on a spectrum that is so broad that it's not that much of a stretch to argue or contend that on some level we can all identify ourselves somewhere along that spectrum, whether it's a mild unhealthy compulsion all the way to some kind of full-blown life implosion. And I'm interested in your sense of that because I feel that your work, and in particular this latest book, Dopamine Nation, which we're going to talk about, really you know, is furthering that sensibility and providing that kind of perspective to a broad audience.
I want to first respond to your use of the word feeling broken. I think that is probably the single most powerful thing that has drawn me to people with addiction in recovery, is that they've passed through that crucible of complete feelings of brokenness, humility, and they've come out the other side as these incredible humans with tremendous wisdom. And the book really is homage to people with addiction who have found recovery, precisely because they have a profound humility, having been through that experience. And although my addictions, which I talk about in the book, are more minor than somebody with severe addiction,
and somewhat comical.
Somewhat comical, but for me they were actually
real for you.
Yeah, they were
it's
real.
A subjective relationship.
Right, it is, and because of the work that I do, I was at some point able to be aware of what was happening to me that I don't think I would have been able to do had I not been in the line of work that I am. But I think most importantly, I've had other experiences in my life that have left me also feeling totally broken, a broken human, full of shame, full of feeling like I wasn't good enough. And so I've really gravitated toward other people who have had that experience of brokenness and yet from it become stronger because of the profound humility that it engenders and a kind of surrender to the universe and a willingness to appreciate that, like, we have so little control. And all the other stuff, all the other good stuff that comes with that.
Yeah, you share a quote near the beginning of the book that I love by this guy, Kent Dunnington, who says, persons with severe addictions are among those contemporary prophets that we ignore to our own demise, for they show us who we truly are.
Yes, and that's who I'm meeting for dinner.
Oh, you are? Cool. Who is Kent Dunnington? I don't know who he is.
So he's a really interesting guy. He's a theologian and a philosopher. He works at Biola University. And I first came across a book he wrote called Addiction and Virtue, which is this philosophical lens through which to consider whether or not addiction really is a disease and whether or not people have a choice and what that choice looks like. And he uses Aristotle. And it's a fascinating look at that question because in the medical field now, I am really steeped in this idea that addiction is a disease. It's a chronic relapsing and remitting disease. There's, verifiable brain chemistry changes that occurs. People become addicted. And yet, and I believe that that's true, and yet there is this element of choice, right? Somewhere along the way, people can choose to get help. Really, that's the fundamental choice piece that's left. They can't necessarily choose to not drink or not use, but they can choose to say, I don't have the ability to choose or not choose to drink, but I do have the ability to hand it over to somebody else who might help me.
Sure.
So anyway,
but that element of choice is difficult. Often it's said that recovery is for people who want it, not those who need it, and too often the person who needs it is unable to make that choice. They're like the most unlikely person to make that choice.
Yes, I think that's right. That's right. I mean, and that's where this kind of mysterious thing happens, where even people who really don't have the ability to make the choice can get into recovery, right? And we see that happen all the time.
Right. And so, in the context of this, we're going to talk about neuroscience, we're going to talk about psychology, we're going to talk about environment, genetics. There's so many things that contribute to this, but in that context of choice, it's so it never ceases to astound me that some people can just have an epiphany and say, this is a problem and I'm going to correct it, and they just do it, while others have to go to the gates of hell before they're ready to reckon with it, and too many just perish without ever having the courage to make that switch.
Yes, that's right.
It's so terrifying and sad in that regard, right?
Yes.
But my perspective is that in the typical case is the person who is kind of sliding down that scale with their addiction until they get to the point where the pain of perpetuating or continuing along that path exceeds the fear of letting go of it and trying something new.
Yeah, that's right. That recognition that there's really no other option but to embrace recovery.
So why don't we define our terms here a little bit?
Okay, yeah.
Like, how do you define addiction?
I define addiction as the continued compulsive use of a drug or behavior despite harm to self and or others. How do you define it?
I mean, that's the standard definition.
Yeah. Right.
And how does that, like, as I mentioned at the opening, there's alcoholism, there's drug addiction. There are some qualitative differences between substance addiction and behavioral addictions. And now that we're in this world where everything has an addictive allure to it, do you qualify our relationship with our devices and online shopping and gambling in the same way, like with this idea of addiction being a spectrum? How does it differ in terms of like our relationship to Twitter versus our relationship to heroin?
I don't really see all that much difference between those things. I think it's just a matter of degree. Obviously, when we're talking about heroin, we're talking about the physiologic dependence and withdrawal as well, which I do think happens with behavioral addictions to things like Twitter. I believe we can have a true physiologic dependence and withdrawal to those behaviors, but not to the same degree as with something like an opioid. But in terms of the psychological aspect of the attachment, I think it's very, very similar. And I believe that because I've seen so many people come through my office who are addicted to things like gaming, gambling, pornography, shopping, and the natural history is exactly the same. The manifestations are the same. The process of getting into recovery is the same. So to me, they're all one bucket.
Mm-hmm. So is there a distinction between kind of an unhealthy, recurring, semi-compulsive habit and what you would consider truly an addiction?
Because both habits and addictive behaviors work through our dopamine reward pathway, I really think it's the same biology. It's just a matter of degree. Mm-hmm. And because I have seen people who can get severely addicted to behaviors like gambling, pornography, video games, to the point where they are suicidal, so their life is threatened by that disease process or that behavior, I really think it's the same biochemistry. It's the same phenomenon in the brain.
Yeah. It seems to me we're in this weird time where, on the one hand, we use the word addiction very cavalierly, like, oh, I'm addicted to my TV show or chocolate or what have you. And yet at the same time, we underappreciate the fact that some of these things truly are addictions, right? Like these two things kind of cross each other in the night in a weird way, which I think prevents us from really looking at them through the appropriate clinical lens.
Yes, I think you're right. I think the way that we cavalierly refer to behaviors as addictions, oh, I'm addicted to whatever, my Netflix show, does minimize the extent to which the brain biology is the same, and also minimizes the impact on our lives. Because if we were to really scrutinize that behavior, I think people would begin to realize that it really truly does have an adverse impact on their lives, mm-hmm. and that, we can't trivialize that. I mean, I've had, for example, journalists writing for esteemed publications, call me to interview me about sex addiction and say to me, well, it's not really an addiction, is it? I mean, it's really just about cultural mores around, what's acceptable sexual behavior and what isn't. And I've had to correct that person and say, no, you're wrong. Mm-hmm. This is really an addiction. It can devastate lives. People can lose their lives over these problems. And it's not just about, polyamory should be socially accepted. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a compulsive, out-of-control phenomenon that has very serious consequences for people.
Sure. If anybody questions that, I encourage you to read the first chapter of your book, because it's the most harrowing, bone-chilling story of a sex addict and the lengths that guy goes to satisfy his need.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and the fact that he's highly educated, that he's a good and kind person, that he has good social supports, he has a great job. I mean, this is what I really want to drive home to people. Like, yeah, there are many risk factors for addiction, but you can have none of those risk factors in today's world and get really addicted.
Do you feel like we're starting to understand that, in the sense that anybody can be an addict regardless of your social status or level of education, etc.?
I do think so. I mean, I do think we've moved beyond this moralizing around addiction. As more and more people struggle with severe addiction, and it crosses all demographics, all social classes, I think people... I mean, for example, in surveys of Americans asking whether or not they think addiction is a biologically based disease, the majority of Americans today will say, yes, it is. And that's different from 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think we have shifted in that regard. But I think what's still new to people is the extent to which we've all become vulnerable to this problem.
Yeah, that is a big difference.
Yeah.
Right. And I do think, although we may recognize that truth in that there is this biological component to it, we still are shocked when we hear the story of the upwardly mobile person who goes down some dark rabbit hole. Do you remember that? It was a New York Times article a couple years ago about the guy, the lawyer in Silicon Valley. It was like a huge profile of his second, his other life.
Yes.
And I just remember how, people were so shocked by that story. Somebody who's been in recovery for a long time, like, I hear that story all the time. But I remember that being a big deal.
Yeah, I think that there's still this kind of self-medication hypothesis thinking around addiction, which is only partially true. And the hypothesis goes like this, that addiction is the result of some other problem, either a willpower problem or a psychiatric illness problem or a sociocultural problem. But you can have none of those problems and still get addicted. And that's what's, like, I've spent a major part of my career re-educating, in particular, psychiatrists around this idea, because for so long we've had this idea that addiction is a downstream consequence of some other problem, but addiction is its own problem. You can have a perfect life and get very, very addicted.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I've had conversations with Gabor Mate, and for him, it's all about childhood trauma. Resolve that, you resolve the addiction. I had Johan Hari here. For him, it's all about lost connections, your connectivity to your friends and your family and your community. And I think those are important pieces in this puzzle, but I'm reluctant to be reductionist about the role that those play in the broader context of addiction.
Thank you so much for invoking those examples, because that shows me that you perfectly understand what I'm trying to communicate here. Because yes, it's true that childhood trauma increases your risk for developing addiction. Yes, it's true that addiction leads to isolation and that the antidote to addiction is social connection in part. But what is so important to understand is you can have the perfect childhood, the perfect parents, the greatest social network, the best spouse, wonderful kids, and you can get really, really addicted. And that is so important for people to understand, and also healthcare providers, because everybody's sort of looking for the reason behind the addiction, but there doesn't have to be a reason behind addiction. Addiction just can be on its own.
I think that's a crucial point. I mean, I get asked very frequently, like, what do you think caused this? Like, what is the source of your addiction? And, I'm heavily indoctrinated in 12-step, and I'm sure I have some biases around that. But one of the things that you learn is that it's fine if you want to analyze that aspect of your origin story, but ultimately it doesn't avail you with the tools for how to live today and how to move productively forward. And there is an argument to be made that it's sort of, a fool's errand to spend too much time on that.
Yes, insight can be the booby prize. Yeah, this is a really very, very important concept. And the other reason it's important is because I think we're natural storytellers, and we want to rationalize irrational behavior. And so the first thing that we try to do when we are doing something that's irrational and self and other destructive is to tell ourselves a story or have someone else tell us a story about why we would do that crazy thing.
And if we can solve that equation, then suddenly everything makes sense, and you can figure this out.
Right.
But it doesn't work that way.
No. I mean, I have had over 20 plus years countless patients come into my office and say, Dr. Lemke, the reason that I'm addicted to alcohol, or I'm addicted to cannabis, or I'm, a compulsive gambler, is because I'm depressed and anxious. And if you would just fix that, then I wouldn't have that other problem. And what I have to do is say to them, you know what? I wish that were true. But here's the truth. Number one, even if I could magically wave my wand and make your depression and anxiety go away, once you're addicted, you're addicted. And if we don't focus on that problem, that's not going to get better. The other thing is that, that relationship between psychological symptoms and addiction, it's complicated, and it's not necessarily that the depression comes first and then the addiction comes. Addiction can lead to depression and anxiety, which is why my first intervention so often is to have people abstain. But I'll never forget a patient of mine who said, Dr. Lemke, I realized I was an alcoholic when I got started on an antidepressant, wasn't depressed anymore, but kept drinking. That was his aha moment, because he was like, oh, I thought I was drinking because I was depressed, but when I stopped being depressed, I was still drinking.
Yeah, that's kind of the genius behind your dual diagnosis clinic, right? It's almost a Trojan horse way of just treating addiction, because the way you get them in the door in a non-threatening way is under the rubric of treating their anxiety or depression, et cetera.
Right, yes. Although it's not without effort, because people are resistant to that idea, right? They come in and they want help with depression, anxiety. They see the addiction as a secondary problem, and it takes all my powers of persuasion to get them on board.
None too happy to be told that we can't deal with your, condition X until we deal with this substance or behavioral addiction that you have. And they storm out and leave a 1-star Yelp review or something.
Exactly. You've got it exactly. You understand.
Yeah, people don't want to hear that. It's interesting. That piece, as a psychiatrist, though, you must have honed tools for how to communicate with people to kind of crack that core.
Yes, and the key piece is to be empathic at the same time that you're telling people what they don't want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Tough. That's a tightrope walk.
It is, but I feel like I've gotten pretty good at it. Having teenagers also helps, to sort of you breathe and you stay calm and you say, I understand what you're saying, like, so the typical sort of validating first, but then you give them kind of the real deal, what the science shows, what my clinical experience shows, what I'm asking them to experiment with, so that they can gather their own data and see if what I'm saying is right.
But on the data piece, this doesn't operate, in a logical framework. It's an emotional framework, and timing is so important, right? Like, I'm happy to talk sobriety with anyone who's suffering, but I've learned to detach from any expectations of what they will or won't do. Like, people get sober when they're ready to.
Yeah. And one of the main things I have to teach my trainees, my fellows, is that an essential part of the work that we do is that we have to actually really care about our patients, but there is a point at which you can care too much. And when we're trying harder than the patient is, or wanting it more than the patient wants it, we're not actually helping them.
Then you got to go to the Al-Anon meeting.
That's right. Everyone's gonna, well, we have to conduct our own little Al-Anon session, right there at work. Because I work with a bunch of young folks, which I can say is one of the most exciting things that's happened in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I couldn't find a medical student under a rock who wanted to learn about addiction. Now they're beating down my door, which is really awesome.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the neurochemistry of addiction. walk me through what's happening in our brains and the role that dopamine plays in all of this.
Yeah, so dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which means that it is the molecule that allows the electrical signal from the presynaptic neuron to be communicated to the postsynaptic neuron, because there's a little gap called the synapse between those two neurons. So neurotransmitters allow fine-tuning of those electrical signals. And dopamine is the most important neurotransmitter involved in motivation and reward. And the fundamental difference between things that are addictive and those that aren't is that things that are addictive release a lot more dopamine. So we have dopamine firing in our brain that occurs at a tonic baseline. And when we do something that's rewarding or pleasurable, we get a little rise in dopamine levels or a spike. So for example, chocolate increases dopamine levels about 50% above baseline. Sex is about 100%, nicotine is about 150%, and things like methamphetamines are 1,000%, partially because of their specific mechanism. But the fundamental way that I explain to patients and medical students, and now in my book, about the neuroscience of addiction so that they can really understand what's happening in the brain is I say that really you have to imagine that in your brain there's a balance, like a teeter-totter in a playground. When we experience pleasure, the balance tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the other. But one of the fundamental rules governing that balance is that it wants to remain level. So with any deviation from neutrality, the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what's called homeostasis. So for example, if I do something pleasurable, like eat a piece of chocolate, I get a little tip to the side of pleasure, a little release of dopamine. But no sooner has that happened than my brain adapts to that phenomenon by downregulating my own dopamine receptors, downregulating my own dopamine transmission. And I imagine that is these little gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the thing about the gremlins is they like it on the balance, so they stay on until the balance is tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's called the opponent process reaction, the hangover, the come down, the after effect. Now, and in my case, that's that moment of wanting another piece of chocolate. If I wait long enough, the gremlin hops off and balance is restored. But if I continue to consume chocolate in ever larger amounts to overcome the tolerance or the number of gremlins on the pain side, then I end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of my balance to fill this whole room. And I'm essentially in a dopamine deficit state with a balance tilted to the side of pain. Now I have to keep using, not to feel good, but just to feel normal. And when I stop using, my balance tips hard to the side of pain. I'm irritable, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I can't sleep. Those are the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance. And that can last a long time.
Yeah. I think it brings up an important kind of broader point about culture in general, and this idea that we live in a situation in which we are, there's this asymmetry in terms of how we approach our lives with respect to pleasure and pain. And we organize our lives completely around the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. But as you kind of astutely put in the book, the more that we pursue that, ultimately the more pain that we reap. Because these systems require a level of homeostasis that we're constantly trying to avoid. So we're just delaying the inevitable onslaught of pain that we so fear.
Yes, absolutely. We live in a world in which we are saturated with dopamine, and we live in a culture which encourages us to pursue it. But the ultimate end result of pursuing dopamine is to feel worse than when you started. And this is really the central message. People are more depressed, more anxious, more suicidal, and more addicted than they were 30 years ago. And I contend that one of the main reasons is because of this relentless pursuit of pleasure that essentially adjusts the dopamine levels, changes the hedonic or pleasure set point to make people anhedonic, meaning without joy.
Yeah, and you can kind of calibrate this in lockstep with how we've progressed from a world of scarcity into a world of overabundance, right? And so these addictive behaviors and substances are ubiquitous. It used to just be, hard drugs and alcohol and cigarettes, et cetera. But now it's literally everything from, the billboards and the advertisements and the marketing messages crafted by Madison Avenue to, of course, the devices that we all carry around with us that are specifically designed to lure us into this, dopamine-induced state, and the food system that's specifically designing foods with the right proportion of salt, sugar, and fat to make it impossible to just eat one potato chip.
Yes, exactly. I mean, addiction can happen now in every realm of life. It's almost impossible to escape it. And the three factors that make anything more addictive are quantity, potency, and novelty. And what our capitalist, technologically innovative world has created is an infinite quantity, incredible potency, and endless novelty and variety.
Yeah. And ubiquitous availability.
Yes,
right.
And
it's
the smartphone.
unavoidable.
Yes, right.
Now.
And now it's 24/7, and it's digital, and it's right to your doorstep. Exactly.
Right. Everything's delivered as well.
Yes, right.
Including all the substances.
Right.
Which we're going to get into. But one curious thing for me, back to the neurochemistry, is why someone becomes, if this dopamine neurotransmitter pathway that you're speaking about seems to be a general quality of all humans, why do some people get addicted and why some people don't? And for example, like alcohol is my drug of choice. Gambling, which debilitates a lot of people, carries no charge for me at all. Like, I just couldn't be less interested in it. Like, how does that work? Is that where genetics and nurturing and all kinds of other things come into play?
Well, first let me speak to the concept of drug of choice, because it's a fascinating one, and there's actually very little science around it. But we know phenomenologically that it's true. What makes one person's balance tip to the side of pleasure doesn't necessarily make another person's balance tip to the side of pleasure. So for me personally, I thought that I was immune to the problem of addiction because the substances that are readily available and that most people get addicted to do absolutely nothing for me. But look what happened to me. I did find a substance that turned out to be incredibly reinforcing for me, essentially romance novels. Right. I know you laugh, but
yeah.
I mean, it
Did you really read the entire Twilight series 4 times?
I did. Yeah. That was my gateway drug. Are you kidding? I really did. And then I moved on from there because I developed tolerance after the 4th time.
It was no longer doing it for you.
It wasn't good enough. It was really mysterious because I was like, this is like a teenage romance novel about vampires, and I was in my 40s. So I mean, that in itself is slightly embarrassing, but it just led to down this whole weird road for me.
Enter 50 Shades of Grey.
Right.
That'll do the trick.
That was my bottom right there. No pun intended. So I guess my point, to answer your question, is that I think we're all going to get addicted to something, because now that special key that works for each of our individual locks, it's out there somewhere, and the World Wide Web will allow us to find it. Having said that, it is true that people bring different degrees of vulnerability to the process of addiction. We do know that about 50 to 60% of the risk of becoming addicted is genetic. That's based on family studies showing that if you have a biological parent or grandparent addicted to alcohol, you are at increased risk of becoming an alcoholic yourself, even if you're raised outside of the alcoholic home in a non-using home. So that's powerful genetics. It's polygenic, it's complex, we don't fully understand it. It's thought to be related to things like impulse control, ability to delay gratification, emotional dysregulation, but we don't really know what it is. Other risk factors include co-occurring psychiatric disorders. People with psychiatric disorders are more likely to develop an addiction, and also how you were raised. If you had a traumatic experience, as we've talked about, that puts you at risk. If you have parents who have explicitly or implicitly condoned substance use, either for recreation or as a coping strategy, that puts you at risk. Things like poverty, unemployment, that puts you at risk. So there are lots and lots of risk factors. But I think that the major risk factor in the modern world, and one which is generally ignored, is simple access. Soundtest. If you have access to a drug, you are more likely to try it and more likely to get addicted to it. And now, as we've talked about, we live in a world of virtually infinite access.
Yeah, you say, there's a quote in the book, something along the lines of, whatever, there is something that will addict you, and it's coming to a website near you.
Right.
Yeah, and it's never been more true. But that idea that there is a drug out there that will be the key to your specific lock, I think, is super interesting. And you use the example in the book of this Stanford student who had all manner of problems and kept screwing his life up and tried all different kinds of drugs and would come back to Stanford and just go down some crazy drug rabbit hole and drop out. And he did this a number of times until he was prescribed Suboxone, and that really kind of balanced him out. And then the question becomes, is this something that he, in his mind, he's like, I need to do this for the rest of my life. Like, I can function as a normal human being right now. The question being, can he be, titrated off of that and be normal? Or is there truth to this idea that some people have a brain chemistry that's lacking in some regard that a substance can solve to make them productive and, quote unquote, kind of normally operative?
Yes, I'm so glad that you have fundamentally understood that example of this very wonderful young man who is still my patient. And he is doing so well in his life. It's just great to see, and he's a great guy. And as you describe, I don't know the answer. I don't know whether he was born with something missing, whether his heroin use broke his brain so that now he needs the opioids for the rest of his life, whether maybe it's really something with our culture and, our inability to create community, which he looked for at Stanford and couldn't find, and that somehow the opioid then becomes a way to adapt to a crazy world. And maybe that's okay. Like, maybe we have to take drugs to just exist in this really nutty world. All those questions are things that I don't have the answers to, but that I think a lot about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's complicated. Isn't it? We'll be back in a sec, but first, if you dig this podcast, and I hope you dig this podcast, then I think you'll really enjoy my latest book, Voicing Change, featuring excerpts from, poignant essays by, and glorious photography of some 50 of my favorite guests over the last 8+ years of doing this thing, this podcast. It's a gorgeous, artful compendium of the show and copious wisdom shared therein, all wrapped in a hardcover coffee table form that provides a great taste of what we do here at the RRP and serves as a beautiful keepsake or gift for the ardent fan. The book is only and exclusively available on our website. Signed copies are available, and we are shipping globally direct to any coffee table on planet Earth. So to learn more and snag your copy today, visit richroll.com/VC. That's richroll.com/VC. All right, let's get back into it. I mean, the addict in me wants to believe that there's some drug out there that will solve my sense of discomfort, and will allow me to just be functional without any kind of pathology attached to it.
Well, here's what I've come to conclude, and this is really a mantra for my own life, that I'm never actually going to feel comfortable in the world or with living, that it's always going to be painful and unpleasant, and that's just the way it is.
Well, that's back to the pain-pleasure kind of paradox, right? I mean, that's sort of a page out of Susan David's thesis of developing emotional resilience, just being okay with the fact that, in this happiness-obsessed world that we live in, acknowledging the truth that life is hard, and the more that we can kind of just be present with that, the more resilience we develop and the more kind of productive and fulfilled we ultimately can become. But people don't want to hear that.
It's really fascinating. So as I've matured as a psychiatrist and as I've just matured, I will say to patients things like, they'll say, I'm not, life is really hard, or I'm just anxious all the time. And I will say things like, yeah, I know what you mean, me too. And you would be surprised, but people are kind of relieved. They're kind of relieved. They're sort of like, wow, if this Stanford doctor is like experiencing anxiety and dysphoria and discomfort, like maybe that's okay. I mean, maybe that's all right for me then too. So by kind of having shared suffering, I think it makes the suffering more bearable. But also, I really think we need to recalibrate our expectations. I know that part of my role as a psychiatrist is to re-educate patients about what they should really be expecting from their lives.
Yeah, I feel like that sort of burst the bubble. You know, every addict thinks that their interior experience is wholly unique and that nobody can relate to it, and their problems are just so off the rails. And that leads to the shame and the embarrassment and the inability to kind of connect with another human being and be honest about what that behavior is.
The terminal.
I mean, the amount of courage that sex addict guy had to summon to be so open with you about what he was actually doing is tremendous.
I know. And that's why my patients are my heroes.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I mean, what he has had to overcome in his life and what the discipline required every single day for him to stay into recovery, that's incredible.
Right, it's superhuman.
It is superhuman.
Yeah, and also, you know, not for nothing, like the level of creativity and craftiness and resourcefulness that the links that the addict will go to fill that need. I mean, in that guy's case, it's like, it's unbelievable, right? Like if you can just get that person healthy and find a healthy outlet for that level of concentrated, energy. It's, it's a powerful thing.
Well, kind of like what you did with your life, right? You took that energy and you channeled it into a whole new way of being, which is a really high standard in your life, right? You have to exert, I mean, maybe it's not, I shouldn't assume it requires discipline, but, you've chosen a path that is not easy in terms of your diet and your fitness and all of that. It's I don't know, you tell me, but it's...
I guess the way I would characterize it is, I work hard in my recovery. I have plenty of character defects. My alcoholism manifests itself in all manner of, errant behaviors. But I've made peace with the fact that my disposition is, attracted to extremes, and I've tried to find healthy outlets for that. People are always saying, oh, you just transferred your alcoholism onto ultra endurance events, or you have an eating disorder because you have this restrictive diet. And, I'll acknowledge that there's truth in all of those things. Whether those are addictive relationships, I'm not quite so sure, because they have moved my life forward.
Right.
Like they haven't created those negative consequences that my alcohol use did.
Right. Yes, and your personality structure, I'm assuming, but this is sort of my job, you have an intensity to you, and your intensity has to find an outlet, and you have to find a healthy and adaptive one, and you have.
And it's dopamine inducing.
That's right.
For sure.
That's right. That's right.
And as somebody who makes their living online, like I'm not immune from, how many people listen to that, or how many, what kind of response did this podcast get, or that Instagram post get?
Right.
And I have to be really careful around that.
Yes, you do. You have to probably do your inventory and be like, am I okay with this, and what's driving this, and what kind of needs are coming up.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes people ask me, well, I've seen people who get into recovery through 12 Steps, Alcoholics Anonymous. It's like it's a cult, and they just get addicted to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm like, so?
Fine.
Did you see their life before and their life after? It's like pretty good now, right? So who cares?
Yeah, it's interesting. On that piece of 12-step, like I said at the beginning, I'm very indoctrinated in that. It saved my life. It continues to save my life. It's, the priority of my life to stay sober and help another alcoholic achieve sobriety. My friends, my community are all, part of this. And I find myself, kind of confronting the fact that every year there's somebody who comes up with some new homespun, way of getting sober and staying sober, and everything you thought you knew about AA is wrong. And now we have, enter stage left, psychedelic, protocols for treating addiction and other mental health disorders, et cetera. And, it's always, I'm constantly I always go back to AA and 12-step, and I have a challenged relationship with my openness to those other things because I know what's worked for me. So I'm curious about how you think about the recovery context and the kind of protocols that are available to us.
To me, AA is one of the most remarkable social movements of the past 100 years. When I have a patient who comes into my office who's been in recovery through 12 steps or is thinking about recovery through 12 steps, I'm like, hallelujah, because those patients are easier to manage and get better and stay better longer. So I think it's a remarkable movement. There is so much wisdom there. As I write about in my book, I try to really elucidate what the neuroscience behind some of the things that AA has been teaching for 100 years. Like I have a whole chapter on truth-telling and why it's so important to tell the truth and what is the neuroscience possibly behind why truth-telling allows us to be in recovery and to manage our compulsive overconsumption. So I think it's a remarkable organization. I think there's divine wisdom in it. And I think that a bunch of the AA bashing that's happened in the last 10, 15 years is just misinformed and misguided. A Cochrane review recently came out that really looked at the scientific evidence behind AA, and there's also good science to support it. So it's not just that my clinical experience tells me that it works and your personal experience, but if you look at the data, people who actively engage in AA and other 12 steps do better longer, even than people who get some kind of professional therapy.
Yeah, I feel like it's sort of lazy and easy to just take shots at it and say, well, I tried it, it wasn't for me. Well, did you try it? What did you actually do,
Well, and I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not the path for everyone, right? It's not the path for everyone. But that doesn't mean that it's not a good path, right? That doesn't mean that somehow you throw the whole thing out the window just because it didn't work for you or you had a bad experience. And then, of course, I absolutely agree with you. When people say they've tried it in the past and it didn't work, I'm always like, well, try it again. This might be the time that it really takes. And for my most severely addicted patients, it's almost universally the best option. And the data support that for the more severely addicted, 12 steps may actually work better than anything else.
People get tripped up on the God part.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
So I'm interested in as a neuroscientist, as a psychiatrist, how do you conceptualize the role of spirituality in all of this? Because it is such a core precept, tenet of 12-step.
And I think that gets back to how we started, where you talked about just feeling totally broken. To me, that is the fundamental spiritual pivot. When we acknowledge our brokenness, that is when we can give it over to something outside of ourselves. And that can take many different forms. But the key piece there is acknowledging that we are not in control. And that when we ask the universe, such as it were, to guide us or help us, that simple reorientation totally changes decision-making. It changes so many things about how we proceed in our lives, the sort of, cognitive math of decision-making or what to do next. And I know I've experienced that, for other reasons, not related to addiction. And I know that's the fundamental pivot that my patients experience, that kind of feeling utterly broken and then looking outside themselves, something larger than themselves, in order to pick those pieces up again and move on.
Yeah, that idea of surrender and the kind of humility that ensues with that.
Right.
Is a tall mountain to climb for a lot of people, and it was difficult for me, but that's really where things kind of open up and you are able to reframe your relationship with how you're living.
Yes, right. It's a total game changer, really, when you make that pivot. And it's amazing the good things that come from doing that.
Yeah. Let's talk about withdrawal a little bit. Back to the biochemistry of everything. Obviously, every substance has a different half-life, and the withdrawal from whatever you're doing is going to be different. But what's going on in your brain? You talked about the kind of seesaw and the way that dopamine operates. When somebody is withdrawing from a substance and they're kind of experiencing the pain that comes with that, what is going on, and what does it take to kind of get past that to the other side?
So there's a distinction between acute withdrawal and protracted withdrawal. Acute withdrawal is essentially where the body manifests the opposite of whatever the drug does. So if you have been using a stimulant, then in acute withdrawal, you will be sedated. If you've been using a sedative, then in acute withdrawal, you will have physiologic restlessness. And that can last anywhere between a few days to a few weeks, depending upon the substance and its half-life, as you point out. But once you get through the acute physiologic withdrawal, I think what's underappreciated generally is that there can be this sustained, protracted withdrawal that can go on for months and in some cases even years, which is primarily psychological symptoms. Again, irritability, anxiety, depression, and insomnia, as well as craving. So this is like ruminative, obsessive thinking about wanting to use. That can even be accompanied by sudden physiologic feelings, sweating, stomach cramps. But that's the piece that in my mind, I visualize the pleasure-pain balance chronically weighted to the side of pain because those neuroadaptation gremlins have essentially camped out there. They like it there, and they're not getting off. And that is what drives relapse, even after people's lives have gotten objectively better, right? They've gotten their spouse back, their job back. And then people see them relapse and they say, well, why would they do that? Everything was going so well. But if you put yourself in the mind of that person, what you would see is that every day they get up, they are anxious, they are irritable, they are craving. And that is what drives relapse. It's sort of that intense physiologic and psychologic suffering, really.
Yeah, after the acute withdrawal, that protracted period where everything just feels gray.
Yes.
Because you're so used to those dopamine hits.
Yes.
And even though your life is getting better, in the back of your mind, you're just like, if I just do this one thing, like I'll be able to write that paper or get through this uncomfortable experience, and I'm just going to do it once. And that's the cunning, baffling, and powerful component here that mystifies the non-addict because it leaves them just, utterly confused as to why somebody would make that choice. But it's almost impossible to avoid.
Yes.
Depending upon the behavior and the substance.
Yes.
Obviously, some are more powerful.
And what I've come to appreciate is that something strange happens to our perception of time when we're in that state. So we're in that state of craving and dysphoria. It really feels like it will never end. I mean, it will. In most cases, we know with sustained abstinence, the gremlins hop off, homeostasis is restored. But when we're in that state, it feels as if it will go on forever. Plus, as you said, we have a way to fix it, right? It's right there within reach. If we use again, we can relieve those feelings. So I think it's the combination of those things, the distorted time perception that those awful feelings will never end, even though they will, and knowing that we can make ourselves feel better if we just use.
And if you're telling the patient they're facing the prospect of possibly years of this.
Right.
I mean, if they're coming off benzos or something like that, they're in for a very long, hard road.
Yes, that's right. Fortunately, in my experience, most people who abstain for 1 month begin to notice improvements in mood, hopefulness, sleep. They might not be where they want to be, but they begin to see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Not always, but that's the piece that then I really have to remind them of. And I say, remember how you felt when, and if you can just hang in there with recovery and with abstinence, incrementally in small ways, you will get better. And I think that's an important function that I serve. kind of a cheerleader and a reminder, because the hippocampus is tricky. I also think that's a major function of AA, right? That we go, I use the we pronoun, so I'm not a member of AA, but in my clinical work I use the we pronoun because, again, I think we're all broken and humbled in the face of this problem. So I'll say to patients, remember how you felt then. Remember how you felt a little bit better. You've done this before. You remember, you have the data from recovery. Hold that close, and tincture of time alone will get you there.
Are there cases where that dopamine balance never again reaches some level of homeostasis?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I think that can happen. Yeah. So, for example, in the book, that I think the case of Chris, possibly one of the things that happened to him was after so many years of opioids and heroin, that the only way that his balance was essentially broken, it was stuck, tilted to the side of pain, and the only way for him to feel normal is to be on, what's called replacement therapy or opioid agonist therapy in the form of Suboxone, which has sustained him feeling well, now going on almost a decade. And I'm talking very, he's doing great. It's not like he's just kind of trudging along. He's doing great.
And he's been able to maintain that level of Suboxone at a base rate. Like he's not asking for more.
No. And I do see that. I do have patients for whom, for reasons we don't understand, they do seem to develop tolerance, but not him. It worked immediately. It worked well. It restored homeostasis. He's re-engaged with life. And he's interestingly somebody who never went to 12-step and never really got a whole lot of psychotherapy beyond, what we do. But that's what works for him.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm always amazed by people who just figure out how to get stuff sober and stay sober without AA. And, I've often thought, what happens if someone like yourself develops some kind of pill that resolves, alcoholism addiction on a biochemical level? Like, would I take it? And I wouldn't trade my experiences or the richness of my life experience and what I get out of this program in this community for that option.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I've heard that from so many of my patients, that they get to a point in their recovery where they actually regard their disease of addiction as a gift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when I first came in and you would hear, there's always the guy who says, I'm a grateful alcoholic.
Yeah, right.
What kind of fucking asshole is that? What are you, like, how, what? I didn't understand it. And now, of course, I completely understand that.
Yeah.
And that goes back to this idea of embracing the painful parts of life and understanding that those are our greatest teachers. And if you can really learn about yourself through those experiences, you can create meaning around them that can be helpful for other people as well.
Yeah, I mean, as a physician, one of the things that attracted me to addiction medicine, in addition to the patients themselves, was the docs in recovery who practice addiction medicine, because they're not like any other types of doctors. When I go to medical meetings that are not addiction focused, everybody's like trying to show off how much they know more than the other guy. And then you go to, an addiction medicine conference and people are like, I'm X number of years in recovery, and oh man, I'm struggling with this character defect and that character defect, and I'm so embarrassed by this or that or another thing I did. It's just such a cool culture.
Yeah, and it's empowering.
Yeah.
I never get tired of hearing the stories. And I'm sure when people read your book, they're going to be so shocked to read these, but I'm so inculcated in that. Like, I'm so used to hearing the craziest stories, and I love it. I love the honesty and the vulnerability of all of it, and it's so empowering, and it's such a beautiful expression of our shared humanity.
Yes, wonderfully put. When I first wrote the book and I gave it to, my agent and the editor, they were like, this story of sex addiction, like maybe you could put it toward the middle or, at the back.
You're just blasting people from page one.
Right, like they were really worried that people would just be so freaked out and it would be so other that that nobody would read it. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to do that, because this is exactly the point that I'm trying to make. Like, pornography and sex addiction, it is everywhere. I mean, we're not being truthful with ourselves if we are pretending like this is not a huge problem. This is a huge problem, and we need to put it up front and center. Now, the book is not just about sex addiction, it's about all kinds of addictions, but like you, I hear these stories every day. So to me, they're not freaky and other. And in the book, I really relate my patient to my own kind of sex addiction that I developed. And I wanted to do that, as you said, I wanted to make sure that people understand, like, this is all of us, right? I mean, this is our shared humanity, as you said.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people will remember you from The Social Dilemma. You appeared in that documentary. And that's a beautiful, starting point to have this conversation about the universality of all of this, whether it's sex addiction or online shopping or porn or gambling or, Twitch streaming. It doesn't matter. Like, it's so ubiquitous. And on some level, we're all addicts, or we're all addicts in waiting.
Right.
And so, I thought it was interesting that in this book, there's nothing on the cover. The word addiction is not used on the cover. Like, this is not a book for addicts to read. This is a book for everybody to read, because I think it's important that we reframe how we think about addiction and all of the levers and pulleys and buttons that are out there right now just waiting to trigger us and lure us into unhealthy relationships.
Yes.
With substances and things and behaviors and everything, all of it out there.
Yes. Yep. You get it, exactly.
So elaborate, I guess. I don't know, that wasn't really the question. But, this idea that we are all addicts, I think, is revelatory and I think people will that may ruffle some feathers. Like, I'm not that. Like, I just know, even when I was in the depths of alcoholism, I would always look at people who were worse than me to say that I'm not this, as opposed to looking for ways to identify or find similarities.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the basic wiring of the brain, we are all wired to approach pleasure and avoid pain. And that is what has kept us alive in a world of scarcity for, gazillions of years. And the fundamental problem now is that we are not living in that world of scarcity. We live in this world of overwhelming abundance, but our brain chemistry and our wiring hasn't changed. So when you are basically wired to seek out pleasure and avoid pain, and you live in a world surrounded by pleasure goods, infinitely available at the tap of a finger, and you're encouraged to avoid pain at all costs, how could we not get addicted? Of course we are, and we will. And I do think people are beginning to relate to that, especially as regards smartphones and things that we're doing online, because people are now observing their own behavior, getting, losing time, getting caught up, spending way more time than they plan, having it interfere with, their parenting or their work. So I do think that I hope that there is sort of this dawning awareness that this is a universal phenomenon, and that, yes, we're variably vulnerable, which is to say we're not all equally going to, become addicted, but that we are all vulnerable to the fundamental problem now.
And that we're essentially outgunned and outmatched.
Yes.
That was a big point in the documentary, that you think that you have some agency here. Well, think again, because you have no idea how much money and science has gone into removing that agency when it comes to your relationship with your devices.
Yes, exactly. And also importantly, and this is again something I learned from my patients, when we are in our addictions, we cannot see the true consequences of those behaviors. In the world of addiction, it's called denial, but it's really a fascinating phenomenon how we cannot objectively observe ourselves or the consequences of these compulsive behaviors until we get some distance from it and look back and then kind of go, wow, that was surreal that I did that much of that thing for that long. Like, that was really bizarre, and I also lied about it and did all these fancy maneuvers to do it more. And now I look back, and it's like, I've had so many of my patients say, it's like another person. It's like that was another person, which is very interesting.
Yeah. Why did I sit on the toilet for an hour staring at my phone?
There are a lot of teenagers out there spending a lot of time in the bathrooms these days, I can tell you that.
Listen, I've done it. Like, I'll call myself out right now on that. When you were talking about the doctors that are your colleagues that are in recovery, it reminded me of my experience in treatment. I went to a treatment center where there was a lot of professionals there on diversion, so a lot of doctors and a lot of pilots. Like the two people that you literally give all of your agency over to. It's very horrifying to realize that surgeons and anesthesiologists and commercial airline pilots were in treatment. And I wanted to share anonymously some of those stories when I was writing Finding Ultra. My publisher said the same thing. They're like, it's too crazy, you can't do that. But to hear these, tales from anesthesiologists like stealing fentanyl and how it made them more productive and leads to ketamine and jumping off roofs and all kinds of crazy stuff. Like there was a doctor who was taking just handfuls of Vicodin every day. There was another neurosurgeon who was an IV morphine addict. Like, it's wild.
Being smart and being highly educated is not any protection against addiction. It might even make you more vulnerable because you think that you'll know.
Superman.
Yeah, or that you'll know when you've crossed the line. I mean, I've treated many docs in addiction over the years, but the one that comes to mind now is an anesthesiologist, who had just a big stash of pills, and he would, take them in all different combinations and permutations, and he just thought, well, I'm an anesthesiologist,
Right.
So like, I know how to dose this stuff, until he didn't, you know what I mean?
There's got to be a higher percentage of anesthesiologists that become addicts versus other doctors.
Yes, higher percentage of anesthesiologists and psychiatrists.
Why psychiatrists?
Oh, we're kind of stuck in our heads.
Is it the brokenness that allures you into the profession to begin with?
I think it's the kind of, I wouldn't want to speak for all psychiatrists, but I don't know. I don't know what it is. I mean, many people who go into psychiatry have family members with mental illness, and so there's kind of a mission-driven purpose, wanting to help others. Sometimes it's, being broken and wanting to help yourself, but I think that's become less and less true as the field has attracted a lot of very high-powered students who are really into neuroscience and such. I don't know what it is. I mean, with anesthesiologists, the assumption is because of increased access to things like opioids and benzos. But I think there's probably a self-selection process where you've got people who are already maybe addicted or vulnerable or almost addicted who then subconsciously choose anesthesia because of the access. I don't know.
Yeah. You're in anesthesiology, you're just dealing with those all the time. And I hear these crazy, like, you get these tiny little vials of fentanyl, and they would, take a little bit of it and fill the rest of it with water, and all the lengths that they would go to be undetected and tapping into the pharma closet.
But, doctors are just regular people, right, with all the same regular problems. I mean, in some ways, what's so tragic about doctors and addiction and the problems of getting into recovery when you're in that profession is because I think the shame is more pronounced because you're supposed to be this healer who's got it all together. One of the things that was kind of scary for me in writing Dopamine Nation was that obviously I disclose, ways that I'm kind of messed up. So I mean, that has brought up a lot of shame for me and kind of worrying what other people will think. And it is fascinating how afraid we are to do that. I think everybody's afraid to do that, but I wonder if physicians are maybe a little more afraid.
Yeah, I would suspect that that's true. But there has to be a cathartic aspect to that for you as well, right? Freeing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I really try to live a transparent life where everything I say and do, if it were published on the front page of a major newspaper, I would be okay with it. And so it's not really maybe as much of a leap for me to disclose those things as it would be for somebody in another field of medicine or somebody with a different past than I've had. But, I've never read a doctor-authored book where they're nothing but the most wonderful healer. Do you know what I mean?
Right. And that leaves you distrustful.
Yeah.
There's something about leading with vulnerability and the honesty incumbent in that leads me to feel like this person has more integrity. It works counterintuitively to the way you think it might.
Yes, well, I'm glad to hear that, and I agree with you. And in my own psychiatric practice, I've really changed the way that I view disclosure. So we are trained to not disclose anything about ourselves, to be sort of that removed Freudian type of person who listens empathically and strategizes with the patient about how to get well, but doesn't actually disclose our own thing. But I'm not sure I believe that anymore. First of all, I mean, our patients can see through us, and we bring ourselves to the practice. But also, I think that it's helpful for patients to know that, like, we're all broken, and we all struggle. And so I try to do it thoughtfully. I'm not like airing my dirty laundry with my patients, going on and on about my problems. But I do strategically talk about my own anxiety, my own depression, my own insomnia, my own sense of life being, kind of a drudgery at times.
That is interesting, because you think of the therapeutic context as you're this blank slate, right? Who never once, gives any clue as to what you think or who you are.
Right. And it's so funny because the expressions on my patients' faces, like when I do that, initially they're sort of like this raised eyebrow, like, get me out of here, get me out of here, this lady's crazy.
Or like, this is about me, not you.
Right. No, I don't get that so much because I don't go on and on. But there's a sort of like, initially this alarm is like I don't want to be treated by a crazy psychiatrist. But then I think on some core level they recognize that, well, maybe she's, not that crazy, and maybe there's a reason that she's telling me that. Although I did have this one patient who was telling me about his flying phobia, and I'm like, oh yeah, I get that. And then he goes, well, and I like to sit next to the window because I feel like if I can see the ground somehow, that makes it less likely that we're actually going to fall. And I'm like, I'm right with you there. I always get the window seat. And that's when he was like, crazy. But he came back. And he managed to get off his benzodiazepines. So it was a success story.
Where are we in terms of the number of people that qualify as being addicted, maybe specifically to substances right now? Like, it's on the rise, right? There's a crazy spike in the percentage of people that are dealing with some form of substance addiction.
Yeah, so here's a crazy statistic. 50% of the world's deaths attributable to addiction occur in those under age 50. So, that's a whole lot of people, right? If we've got more than half of the world's deaths due to addiction in people under 50, that's kind of scary. And then if you look at specifically things like alcohol, so rates of alcohol have gone up in the last 20 years, including in groups that were previously immune to alcohol addiction. Rates of alcohol use disorder or alcohol addiction have gone up 50% in people over age 65.
From when to when?
Between the late 1990s and today. And they've gone up 80% in women, which is a really fascinating change. So
what do you make of that?
Well, it's complicated. First of all, for older people, what I make of it is that we are living longer, right? And that as people age and their brains age, a lot of folks who have been able to kind of moderate their use for most of their middle years are finding in their latter years that something changes biochemically, psychologically, and all of a sudden they pop off into addiction. I see these people all the time. People, basically like baby boomers, right? Who's like, I've smoked pot every day since I was 25. I never had a problem. All of a sudden, I'm dabbing, right? And it's unmanageable. And that's in some ways harder because now you have 65 years of habit and learned experience around using every day. You're going to give that up when you're 65, 70. It's a lot. You have less brain plasticity to form new habits. So I think the older people phenomenon is both a function of just living longer, having more time, maybe more boredom, and then also the more potent drugs that we have now, the more variety, people slipping into addiction in older age. For women, it's really fascinating because I see that all the time where, traditionally the rates of addiction of men to women, the ratio has been like 5 to 1.
Right.
5 men to every 1 woman with addiction. Now it's 1 to 1 in millennials. It's like the equal amounts. And I think, I could speculate on why that is. I guess I will speculate. I think that, with the women's movement and, more opportunity and more equality, I think there are trade-offs, right? That the burden that comes with burdens that may be leading women into more addictive tendencies. Plus, you've got more potency and more variety.
Right. Yeah. That's what came to mind for me immediately. Like the proliferation of so many different drugs now. And the potency of them.
Yes, right.
And
that's a big part of it. That's a big part of it. But I also think part of it is, culturally, like women weren't really supposed to imbibe, and now, like that's not really those cultural mores aren't really there anymore. For better and for worse.
Yeah, that's interesting. And how does that break down in terms of opioid addiction? Like what percentage of that can be attributed to opioids?
In terms of addiction to opioids, I don't know if we have consistent science on that. Some studies show that women are more likely to be addicted to opioids. Other studies show men. One thing we know for sure is that men are more likely to die from opioids, and that's sort of interesting and not entirely clear why that is. But I think in general, the rates break down to about 50-50.
Right, and then in terms of addiction, at large, like in this spike that we're seeing in the rates of addiction, how much of that overall, what portion of that is opioid related?
Well, if you look at the current drug overdose deaths, the majority involve some kind of opioid. Polypharmacy is the norm in drug overdose deaths, and in fact, what confers a lot of the risk is polypharmacy, so mixing a bunch of drugs together is a lot more dangerous than monotherapy. But a lot of times people are taking a mixture of drugs and don't know it, right? Because a counterfeit pill that they think is a Xanax bar actually has flualprazolam, a benzodiazepine designer drug, plus a little bit of fentanyl in it, and they don't know that that's what they're taking. What did you ask me? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get at. I want to kind of segue into the whole opioid crisis, because this is obviously an area of expertise for you, and as a foundational to that, like just getting a sense of how big the opioid problem is and what percentage of addiction overall it kind of commandeers.
Okay, so there's somewhere between 2 and 15 million Americans today addicted to opioids. Why is the range so large? Because the way that we do those surveys varies a lot. According to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, it's about 2 million Americans addicted to opioids, with about 11 to 12 million Americans misusing prescription opioids. So slightly different. Misuse is not necessarily addiction. Addiction is crossing into kind of crossing a threshold there. But on the outer range, some studies who have included, for example, homeless populations or incarcerated populations have gotten up to as high as 15 million Americans addicted to opioids. So it's by any count, millions of Americans either addicted to and or misusing opioids. And then if you look at opioid-related overdose deaths, what you see is that they've essentially been rising steadily since the late 1990s. They seem to go down and plateau a little bit in 2018, but in 2020 they rose the biggest percentage they have in the last 20 years.
Is that pandemic related?
Yeah, we think it's pandemic related, a combination of an ongoing potent drug supply, especially including fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine or heroin, combined with increased isolation and decreased access to treatment.
Right. So wild.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how we got here. I mean, you wrote this other book, Drug Dealer MD. It's a pretty fascinating dissection of the origins of the opioid crisis, how we got here, and the multiple contributing factors to it. Talk a little bit about that. The idea of big pharma and big medicine being in cahoots to create this problem that we're having such difficulty figuring out.
Yeah, so in the early 2000s, I started seeing more and more patients coming in addicted to the opioids that their doctors were prescribing. And that was really at the beginning of my own personal re-education around addiction and how to help people with addiction. And I learned so much from my patients and my colleagues about addiction medicine, and really it transformed the way that I practice. So I assumed that if I just educated my colleagues about addiction, they would all also see the light and stop prescribing in that way. And what I discovered was that even with re-education, even when, for example, I consulted on a patient and let them know, oh, by the way, this person went to 10 other doctors in the same month to get Vicodin, you should stop prescribing for them, they didn't stop prescribing. And that was really the moment where I thought, what is going on here? This is really bizarre. This is a really good person. This is a highly educated person. Why on earth are they continuing to prescribe in this way? And what I then discovered through my research is all of the invisible incentives inside of medicine that keep doctors prescribing in ways that are orthogonal to patients actually getting better. And the most shocking discovery for me was the extent to which the opioid pharmaceutical industry had essentially infiltrated every aspect of medicine to promote opioid prescribing. And their influence was so enormous and so powerful that essentially doctors were not able to not prescribe. And the vehicles that pressured them into it were shame, basically saying pain is undertreated, and the reason it's undertreated is because you are opioid phobic, afraid of opioids, so you need to prescribe more. It was things like the Joint Commission creating guidelines and quality measures that said every doctor has to ask every patient about pain, whether or not they look like they're in pain, and use this pain scale from 1 to 10 and prescribe opioids if they endorse pain. It was things like the Federation of State Medical Boards saying, if you don't treat pain using opioids effectively, you're going to get sued. You're opening yourself up to a lawsuit. And behind all of those regulatory bodies and all of those professional medical societies were millions of pharmaceutical dollars.
Yeah, and in order to really understand this, you have to understand the history of how the medical establishment has thought about pain and what it means and how to treat it.
Yeah, I mean, for example, the whole concept of chronic pain that lasts every day for more than 3 months, 3 months being the time that we consider normal tissue healing should occur, that concept of chronic pain didn't even exist until like the middle of the 1900s. Prior to that, pain had been considered to be a downstream effect of a disease or an injury. The whole phenomenon of more and more people developing these chronic pain conditions, as well as the industry that goes along to treat it, is about 50 years old. And that industry, in effect, of course, in a way, has generated the pharmaceutical companies that now serve that cause, to the extent that we have the opioid epidemic.
Right. So originally, pain was construed as something that potentially had benefits in terms of accelerating healing or helping you to develop some kind of physical or emotional resiliency. At a certain point, the thinking shifted to no, all pain is bad. It creates all kinds of trauma and it should be ameliorated at all costs. Enter the pharmaceutical industry and a whole infrastructure around making sure that nobody ever feels pain ever, and demonizing any doctors who are not going to ensure that that patient walks out of the office armed with everything they need to never experience pain. And that early idea proved to be untrue, right? And we're seeing the kind of waste byproduct of wrongheadedness.
Yes, exactly. I mean, not only did it turn out to be untrue, but it turns out that taking opioids every day for long periods of time can actually make pain worse through this process of opioid-induced hyperalgesia, which is basically the pleasure-pain balance, neuroadaptation, and changing set points around pain such that pain will get worse if you take an opioid every day to treat pain. And you're absolutely right. When, in the middle 1800s, when general anesthesia was first invented, the leading surgeons in this country actually were resistant to using it because they felt like experiencing some amount of pain boosted the cardiovascular response, boosted the immune response, and it was good for tissue healing. Now, I don't know of any objective science showing that that's true, that pain actually expedites healing, but there are studies now showing that opioids can slow healing down.
Right. That's a shocking thing to realize, right?
Yeah.
And much like the cigarette industry, the pharmaceutical industry put a lot of time, money, and effort into creating a narrative here. I think I read something about, there was a guy, what was his name, who was propagating this narrative that only 1% of people who were on opioids would develop some kind of addiction. And that became kind of like the trope that doctors would think. It became an entrenched kind of talking point.
Yeah, so that basically started with Purdue's promotion of OxyContin. In 1980, there was a letter to the editor, which doesn't count as a study. It's just like the equivalent of a medical journal tweet by two individuals called Porter and Jick, saying that in a cohort of 11,000 hospitalized patients, they only had 4 people who manifested signs and symptoms of opioid addiction. So in 11,000 patients who got opioids to treat their pain, only 4 of them got addicted, which comes out to less than 1% in that population. And that one tiny little data point, which is not really a study, was then used by Purdue Pharma in their promotion of OxyContin to say, hey, if you're a doctor using opioids to treat a patient with pain, less than 1% of those individuals will get addicted to opioids. It turns out that is totally untrue. A meta-analysis by Voles et al., which came out around 2015, shows that 1 in 4 patients prescribed an opioid for a bona fide pain condition will develop an opioid use problem, and 1 in 10 will get severely addicted. But those kinds of messages that addiction is rare or uncommon or few will get addicted as long as you're a doctor and they're a patient in pain was really believed by most of the medical establishment through the first part of this century. And almost on a magical biological level, like there must be something magically protective biologically if a person has pain when you give them an opioid, like somehow that's going to erase the addictive part, but it doesn't. It's not true. It doesn't work like that.
Right. So the conspiracy-minded person inside of me, pictures the mustache-twirling guy at the board meeting at pharmaceutical company X, getting on the phone with somebody at the FDA. Like, how does this all break down? Like, what's conspiracy and what's reality in terms of how the tectonic plates of medicine and pharmacy and government kind of created this situation that has produced the crisis that we're in?
Well, I'm not sure I would use the word conspiracy to describe it, but what we definitely have is misleading promotion on the part of opioid manufacturers that represented as science what in fact was untrue messages about what opioids can and can't do, essentially overstating the benefit and understating the risk, in a very fertile ground of healthcare providers who wanted to believe it. Why did they want to believe it? Because medicine has transformed in the past 30 years into basically assembly line, production, quota, incentives. We have to get patients in and out. We have to do it quickly. We have to make sure that they're satisfied customers. When their insurance changes, we may never see them again. They'll see another doctor. There's a different doctor for every different body part. So the misleading messages were also delivered to a population and institutions for which those were very convenient myths. And I think it's that combination, the intense lobbying, the intense promotion, the millions of dollars given to the FDA, the DEA, other regulatory bodies, promoting these messages. And then you've got healthcare providers who frankly really want to believe them because they're seeing more and more patients with terrible and debilitating pain for which they don't have the time or the energy or the resources to provide something like, a plant-based diet as a way to get well, or even physical therapy, right? They've got to get them in and out the door.
Yeah, and then layer on top of that the prospect of malpractice if you don't treat that pain, right? So you have this misalignment of incentives that create this problem.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And the pernicious thing is that this becomes the entry point for so many people who otherwise might have never experienced any form of addiction, right? And I know so many people in the program who end up relapsing because they go in for a knee surgery or they have a back problem or they've been sober for 20 years. And it takes them out.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. So in the 1960s, if you asked somebody who was addicted to heroin what their first exposure to opioids was, 80% would say that it was heroin, right? They started with heroin as their first opioid. In the early part of this century or today, if you ask people who use heroin what was their first exposure, 80% of them will say it was a prescription opioid.
Yeah, that's crazy. So this spike in heroin use that we're seeing is really a function of opioid addiction. And
prescription opioid addiction.
When you've exploited all the doctors who will tolerate you and you've got nowhere else to go, you're going to find the heroin dealer.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And when that heroin supply is spiked with fentanyl, then you've got people who are dying because fentanyl is so much more potent.
I know that you've testified on the Hill, you've spoken at the White House, you're involved in, policy on some level. What's your sense of where we're at now with redressing this crisis?
Well, just last week I was in New York testifying in the first jury trial of this opioid litigation. And as you probably read in the paper today, there's a $26 billion settlement in the offing.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. I was in New York. I would have come.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was open to the public, so you could have come. 7 grueling days.
Yeah, tell me about this.
Well, it was fascinating. So, first of all, the opioid litigation is understandably confusing to people because people think that the settlement with Purdue that happened, some already, I think, last year, even though it's still evolving, is sort of the whole deal and the done deal. What they don't realize is that there's something called the multi-district litigation, which is essentially thousands of states and counties coming together to sue not just Purdue and other opioid manufacturers, but also the distributors that truck the opioids from the manufacturers to the pharmacies, and the pharmacies who have dispensed these opioids to the public, thereby creating what the lawyers call a public nuisance. And the idea of a public nuisance is just that the actions on the part of the opioid pharmaceutical industry led to and caused the opioid epidemic. So there have been a series of bellwether trials for the multi-district litigation that I've been involved in as a medical expert witness. I wrote a report, I've testified, but the trial in New York last week is the first jury trial that is trying this. And it started out with, I think, 11 defendants, and Johnson & Johnson settled, the distributors settled. So what's remaining is just a smattering of opioid manufacturers, not including Purdue, for example, which has declared bankruptcy. You can't sue somebody who's in bankruptcy. So it's a very...
Purdue behind OxyContin?
Yes, so Purdue, Purdue is behind OxyContin. And they were sort of like the genius, so to speak, like the sort of malevolent genius behind marketing opioids in a way that would be extremely palatable to prescribers and would overstate the benefits and understate the risks. And then others, copied them, in suit. So what would be great is if there could be some kind of global settlement so that all these different county and state trials would come together and be a part of that global settlement so that the litigation could end. Because we can't keep trying this over and over again. And the good news is that it looks like a global settlement, this $26+ billion, may actually be in the offing. It's not a done deal that all the different states and counties in the multi-district litigation have to agree to it. But hopefully the details will be able to worked out.
Yeah, because it's a settlement, it doesn't create some kind of case law precedent, but certainly a chilling effect, right? So what is the kind of implications of that settlement, and how does that impact how pharma kind of thinks about this and moves forward?
Oh yes, I'm remembering that you have a law degree.
Yeah, sorry. It's been a while.
No, it's good. Well, so what's interesting, so settlements are, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but this is what I've learned through this experience. So settlements can take many different forms. This settlement that's in the offing, importantly, the defendants are not admitting to wrongdoing, right? But they're providing money to abate the harms of the opioid epidemic. And one of the things that looks like will come out of it, in terms of monitoring diversion, or basically pills going to people other than who was intended, is some external agency, which I think is really good, so to monitor diversion. Because essentially what